Brock Hargrove threw the envelope onto the porch board so hard it skidded off the edge and landed in the dirt. "Take it," he said. "That's $40 and a ticket back to Pueblo. More than fair for a woman who showed up with baggage I never asked for." Evelyn Voss did not reach for the envelope. She stood at the top of the porch steps with her hands clasped in front of her coat, and she did not flinch, though the muscles in her jaw moved once, like she was biting down on something she refused to swallow. Beside her, pressed against her hip, was a 5-year-old girl holding a small brown suitcase with both hands. The girl's knuckles were white. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere past Brock's left shoulder, the way children look when they are trying very hard not to understand what the adults around them are saying. Silas Hargrove watched all of this from 15 feet away, still holding his horse's reins, still wearing 3 days of trail dust on his coat. He had ridden back from the southern pasture that morning, expecting nothing more complicated than a hot meal and a quiet evening. Instead, he had come home to find his older brother standing on the porch of the ranch house, like a man conducting business he found mildly inconvenient. The little girl's lip trembled once. Then she pressed it flat and looked down at her suitcase. Silas let go of his horse's reins. If you have ever watched a child try not to cry in front of strangers, really watched it, the way they pull every muscle in their small face tight and go very still, as if stillness itself might protect them, then you already understand what Silas Hargrove felt standing in that yard. And if you have ever been the person with the power to walk away from that child and chosen not to, then you understand what he did next. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way through. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that porch in Colorado, 1884, and the moment one man's cruelty set 3 lives onto a road none of them expected. The ranch sat on the eastern edge of the San Luis Valley, where the land flattened out after miles of rough country, and the sky came down so wide and heavy in winter that a person could feel the weight of it pressing on their shoulders. The Hargrove brothers had worked that land for 11 years, since their father died and left them the deed, the debt, and the understanding that neither of them had the option to quit. The ranch was called Hargrove Cattle, which was not a name so much as a description, and it ran about 400 head in good years and considerably fewer in bad ones. The past 2 years had been bad ones. Brock was 49 and ran the operation the way their father had, by instinct, by stubbornness, and by an absolute unwillingness to admit when something wasn't working. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He did not drink to meanness or raise his hand to people smaller than him. But he had a particular talent for making decisions that affected other people, and then refusing to examine those decisions once they were made, which produced a kind of cruelty that was worse in some ways, because it wore the mask of practicality. The mail order arrangement had been Brock's idea, arrived at the previous spring after the housekeeper quit, and the winter stores came up short, and Brock spent 3 weeks eating salt pork and looking at the same 4 walls until he concluded that what the ranch needed was a woman to run the house. He had written to a placement agency in Denver, specified that he wanted someone capable and not prone to complaints, and received in return a letter from one Evelyn Voss of Pueblo, age 31, formerly a bookkeeper's assistant, widowed 2 years prior, willing to consider relocation. They had exchanged 4 letters. Brock had not mentioned in any of them that he expected the arrangement to be as businesslike as a livestock purchase, and Evelyn had not mentioned in any of hers that she had a daughter. Both of those omissions were now standing on the porch. "You should have told me," Brock said. His voice was even. That was the thing about Brock. He was always even when he was being the most unreasonable. A child changes the terms. "I wrote for a housekeeper, not a nursemaid situation. I wrote for a husband," Evelyn said. And her voice was steady too, but it was a different kind of steady, the kind that costs something. "The agency assured me the arrangement was standard. I disclosed my situation in the letter I sent last month. I didn't read it." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "You didn't read it. I've been busy. The point stands. I can't have a child underfoot on a working ranch. She's 5 years old. She won't be underfoot. She already is." Brock glanced down at the little girl with the suitcase and then away again, quickly the way a person looks away from something they don't want to be moved by. "The money's fair. I'll drive you to town myself." Silas had been standing very still through all of this, the way he did when he was deciding something. People who didn't know him sometimes mistook that stillness for slowness. He was not a fast talker, or a fast thinker in the usual sense. He didn't reach conclusions quickly, or announce them loudly. But when he arrived at something, he arrived completely, without a lot of second-guessing or looking for an exit. He looked at the little girl. She had brown hair pulled into 2 uneven braids, which meant she had probably done them herself or her mother had done them in poor light or in a hurry. and she was wearing a coat that was almost the right size, almost but not quite, the sleeves a fraction too short. She was looking at the suitcase in her hands with the fixed concentration of someone who has decided that one thing in the world is safe to look at, and everything else is not. He had no idea what her name was. He didn't know anything about her except that she was 5 years old, and trying very hard not to cry, and that his brother was about to put her back in a wagon. "Brock," he said. Brock turned. "Stay out of it, Silas." "I'm not staying out of it." The two brothers looked at each other. They had spent 11 years disagreeing in the particular way that people who share blood and land and history disagree not loudly, not with drama, but with a kind of settled weight that meant neither of them was going to move easily. "This is my house," Brock said. "It's our house," Silas said. "Same as it's our ranch and our debt. And I'm telling you that you're not sending them away tonight." What happened in the next 30 seconds was not a fight. Exactly. Brock did not shout and Silas did not raise his fists, because they were both past 50 between them and had learned a long time ago that the loudest arguments were usually the emptiest ones. What happened was a negotiation conducted entirely through silence and posture, the way men who have worked together for decades sometimes communicate in the set of the shoulders, in the angle of the jaw, in the length of the pause before someone speaks. Brock spoke first, which meant he had already lost and knew it. "Fine," he said. "Tonight. But this is not a permanent arrangement." He went inside. The screen door closed behind him with a flat, dry crack. Evelyn let out a breath. It was the first sign she had given that any of this was costing her anything, and it lasted only a second before she pulled herself back together. Then she looked at Silas, and there was something careful in her expression, not gratitude exactly, more like the look of a person who has learned to assess new situations before deciding how to feel about them. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Silas said. "The spare room's got a leak in the roof I haven't fixed, and the mattress has seen better years. I'll get your bags." The little girl looked up at him for the first time. She had gray eyes, very serious, and there was a dried tear track on her left cheek that she had wiped away at some point and not entirely cleaned. She looked at him the way children look at very large, unfamiliar things, with wariness, but also with a kind of frank assessment that adults tend to lose. "I can carry my own bag," she said. Her voice was smaller than she was trying to make it sound. Silas crouched down so he was roughly at her level. He was a big man, 6'2", broad through the chest, with hands that looked like they had been built for a slightly larger world, and he was aware that getting down to a child's eyeline was sometimes the difference between terrifying them and not. "I know you can," he said. "What's your name, Mabel?" "Mabel, I'm Silas. You hungry?" She considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a complex question. "Yes," she finally said. "But I don't want to be any trouble." Something in Silas's chest did a thing he couldn't name and didn't try to. He straightened up and picked up the larger of the two bags sitting beside Evelyn's feet. "You're not trouble," he said. "Come on inside before you freeze." The ranch house was not what Evelyn had imagined when she read the letters, but then very little about the past several hours had matched what she had imagined. She had built a version of this place in her head over 4 months of correspondence, practical, modest, but functional. A working household. A man who ran cattle and needed someone to manage the domestic side of things, which was a negotiation she understood and was prepared for. What she had not prepared for was the degree to which everything had been allowed to accumulate without anyone attending to it. Wasn't filth exactly. Silas was not a dirty man. But the house had the particular disorder of a space where two people had been surviving in it rather than living in it. Dishes clean but stacked wrong. Curtains functional but never replaced. A calendar on the wall still showing February of the previous year. The wood stove in the kitchen needed cleaning. The window above the sink had a crack in the corner, sealed with what appeared to be a strip of oilcloth and someone's best intentions. She stood in the kitchen doorway and did a rapid, silent inventory of all of it. "It's not much," Silas said, from behind her. "It's fine," she said, which was not the same as saying it was good, but it was honest, and she suspected that honesty was going to be more useful here than politeness. Mabel had stopped in the middle of the kitchen and was staring at the ceiling, where a string of dried herbs hung from a hook sage, it looked like, and something else she couldn't identify. Her mouth was slightly open. "That smelled good," she said. "That's sage," Silas said. "It keeps things." He seemed to realize mid-sentence that he didn't know how to finish that explanation in a way that would mean anything to a 5-year-old, and he stopped. Mabel nodded as if this made complete sense. "Okay." Silas made them eggs and salt pork, which was not much of a dinner but was what was available at that hour. And he put out bread that was 2 days old and still edible, and a jar of plum preserves that he mentioned had been made by the woman who used to do their laundry. Evelyn ate carefully and without complaint. Mabel ate with the focused energy of someone who had not had a proper meal since morning, which, when Evelyn was asked, turned out to be accurate. Brock did not come to dinner. Silas did not explain this, and Evelyn did not ask. After the dishes were cleared, Silas showed them the spare room. It was on the north side of the house, which was the cold side, and the roof leak he had mentioned was visible as a brown stain in the corner of the ceiling, currently dry because the last rain had been 2 weeks ago. The mattress was, as advertised, past its best years. But the room had a door that closed, and a small window, and a hook on the back of the door for a coat, and Evelyn had slept in worse. "I'll get you extra blankets," Silas said. "Nights are cold." "Thank you." She paused. "Mr. Hargrove, Silas." "Silas." She said the name carefully, like she was placing it somewhere specific. "What happens tomorrow?" He leaned against the doorframe and thought about that. He was not the kind of man who offered reassurances he wasn't sure he could back up, which meant there were sometimes long pauses in his conversations while he figured out what he actually meant to say. "Tomorrow," he said, "I go check on the cattle and you get some rest. After that, we figure out the rest." "And your brother?" Another pause. "Brock's Brock. He won't be unkind. He's just stopped. He made a decision and he's stuck with it. That's how he is." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "And you? What did you decide?" Silas considered the question with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. "I decided I wasn't sending a woman and a little girl back out into the dark in November," he said. "The rest of it I haven't figured out yet." She nodded. It was an honest answer. She had not expected an honest answer, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "Good night, Silas," she said. "Good night." He pulled the door shut and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of Mabel's voice, muffled through the wood, something high and quiet that he couldn't make out the words of, and then Evelyn's voice answering, lower. The way a mother talks to a child at the end of a hard day, when she's trying to make the world sound smaller and safer than it is. He went to find the extra blankets. Brock was in the main bedroom when Silas knocked. "Come in." Silas came in. Brock was sitting at the small writing desk by the window, which he used mostly for going over accounts, though from the look of the ledger open in front of him, he hadn't actually been looking at anything. He was just sitting there in the lamplight, looking like a man who had come to a conclusion and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. "I'm not changing my mind," Brock said. "I know," Silas said. He sat on the edge of the bed, which was not something he usually did in Brock's room, but he was tired enough that standing felt like an argument. "I'm not asking you to." This surprised Brock enough that he turned. "Then what?" "I'm just telling you how it is. They stay, at least for now, until we figure out something better. The woman can have the spare room. The girl is 5 years old, Brock. She's not going to destroy anything." "It's not about destruction," Brock said. "It's about what I agreed to and what I didn't." "You agreed to write some letters and not read all of them," Silas said. "That's about what you contributed to this situation." Brock's jaw tightened. "The agency should have disclosed." "She said she wrote. She said she disclosed it. Maybe she did and maybe she didn't. I don't know, and neither do you because you didn't read it." Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "What I know is that there's a woman in the spare room who traveled 300 miles in November to honor an agreement, and a little girl who cried in the yard today and then tried to pretend she hadn't, and I'm not putting either of them back in a wagon because your paperwork got complicated." The lamp between them flickered in a draft from the window. Brock looked at the ledger. "The ranch can't support extra mouths." "The ranch is barely supporting us," Silas said. "Which, if you'd let me look at the books, I've been trying to tell you for the better part of a year." He stood up. "Get some sleep. We'll talk tomorrow when you're not busy being wrong." He left before Brock could answer, which was the only way to win an argument with his brother, not by winning it, but by removing yourself from it before it got entrenched. Silas did not sleep well. This was not unusual. He had never been a deep sleeper, had spent too many years listening for the sounds that meant something had gone wrong with the cattle, or the weather, or the fencing, to learn how to shut that part of his brain off entirely. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, and thought about the woman in the spare room and the little girl beside her. He had not brought a woman to this ranch since his mother died 15 years ago. He had not particularly wanted to. He was not, as far as he could tell, a man who was built for the kind of easy companionship that some men seem to manage without thinking about it. He was too quiet for most people, too slow with words, and he had a habit of saying things that were true but not necessarily what people wanted to hear, which had not endeared him to the few women he'd encountered socially at church socials and town dances. He had made peace with this, or something that looked enough like peace that he had stopped examining it closely. What he had not made peace with, had in fact been struggling with for the better part of 2 years, was the state of the ranch. The numbers Brock kept in the ledger were bad. Not catastrophically bad, not yet, but trending towards something that was going to become catastrophic within another year or two if nothing changed. The cattle operation was losing efficiency because the north fencing needed replacement, and they kept losing animals to the neighboring rancher's land and then spending half a day recovering them. The accounts were a mess because Brock did them in his head and wrote down only what he felt like writing. which meant there were gaps in the records that made it impossible to know what they actually owed and to whom. Silas knew how to run cattle. He did not know how to fix books. He thought about what Evelyn had said she did before she was married, a bookkeeper's assistant. He thought about the way she had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room not with dismay, but with that quiet inventory-taking expression, like she was already calculating what needed to happen and in what order. He stared at the ceiling for another hour and then got up and started a fire in the kitchen stove, because it was 4 a.m. and he was not going back to sleep and the cattle needed checking and he might as well start the day. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he heard the floorboards in the hallway. He looked up. Mabel was standing in the kitchen doorway in a nightgown that came to her ankles, holding the small worn suitcase in both hands. She had her braids loose now, hair everywhere, and she was squinting slightly in the lamplight the way children do when they've been awake, but pretending not to be. Silas set his cup down. "You all right?" She looked at the kitchen. She looked at him. She looked at the stove. "I woke up," she said. This seemed to be the entire explanation. "You want some warm milk?" He had no idea where this came from. He had not made warm milk for anyone in at least 15 years and was not entirely confident he remembered how. Mabel considered this offer with her characteristic gravity. "Yes, please," she said. She climbed onto the bench at the kitchen table. It was a long climb for her, and she managed it without asking for help, swinging her legs up with the determined athleticism of a child who has had to manage things for herself, and set the suitcase on the bench beside her, within reach, and watched him with serious gray eyes while he found a small pot and poured milk into it and set it over the low part of the stove. "Why are you up?" she said. "Not a question, exactly more of a conversation opener." "Early riser," he said. "Mama says some people are and some people aren't." She thought about this. "I'm not usually, but I couldn't sleep. Happens." He stirred the milk slowly. "New place." "We've been in a lot of new places," she said, and then seemed to decide she had said something too revealing because she looked at the suitcase. "Since Papa died." Silas did not respond immediately because he was the kind of man who understood that not every statement needed a response, and that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was let something sit in the air without rushing to cover it with words. "What's in the suitcase?" he asked after a moment. She looked at it. "My things. Important things?" She nodded seriously. "A picture of my papa. A blue button that was my grandma's. A book with pictures of horses." She paused. "And a sock." "A sock. Just one. I lost the other one in Cincinnati." She said this with the calm acceptance of someone who has made their peace with certain irreversible facts. "I kept the other one anyway." Silas poured the warm milk into a cup and set it in front of her and sat back down across the table. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way he had wrapped his hands around his coffee, mirroring him without realizing it, and blew on it carefully. "Is your brother going to make us leave?" she asked. She was looking at the cup. Silas thought about lying, which took approximately half a second, and then abandoned it. "I don't know yet," he said. "But you're not leaving tonight." She looked up at him. "Do you want us to leave?" The directness of it would have caught him off guard if he hadn't been watching her for the past several hours, and formed a preliminary assessment of the kind of person she was. She was a child who had learned that adults would shelter you from information that concerned you directly, and she had decided at 5 years old that she preferred to ask the question outright and take whatever answer came. He respected that. He did not get a lot of chances to respect 5-year-olds, but this one had earned it. "No," he said. "I don't." She looked at him for another moment with those gray eyes, checking for cracks in the answers, and then she seemed to find it satisfactory, because she went back to her milk. They sat in the kitchen together while the sky outside slowly changed from black to the deep charcoal blue that comes just before dawn, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything more than they had already said. Evelyn found them there at 5:30, both sitting at the kitchen table, Mabel working on the last of her milk, Silas back on his second or possibly third cup of coffee, the lamp burning low between them. She stopped in the doorway and took in the scene with an expression that was difficult to read. "She woke up," Silas said. Unnecessary explanation, but he offered it anyway. "She does that." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "You should have woken me." "I didn't want to," Mabel said simply. Evelyn looked at Silas. He shrugged slightly, which he realized was probably not a useful contribution to the conversation, but he had spent the past hour sitting companionably with a child who had decided he was acceptable, and he didn't want to undo that by saying something wrong. "Sit down," he said to Evelyn. "There's coffee." He hesitated for just a moment, that same careful assessment, and then came to the table and sat. He poured her a cup and pushed it across. She wrapped her hands around it the same way Mabel had, and Silas noticed this and said nothing. "What time does work start?" she asked. "Already started," he said. "I'll go check the cattle at 6. But he paused. He had been thinking about something for the past hour that he had not entirely figured out how to say. I want to talk to you about something first. Evelyn looked at him over the rim of her cup. The ranch accounts, he said. They're a mess. Brock does them his way, and his way has some gaps. I've been trying to figure out how bad it is for a while, and I can't tell, because I can't track what I can't see. He set his cup down. You said you were a bookkeeper's assistant. For 4 years, she said. Before Mabel, and then part-time after. Could you look at the ledger? Tell me what you see? She considered this. I'm not a bookkeeper, I know. And your brother may not want... Brock doesn't have to want it, Silas said. I do. Another pause. She was weighing something. He could see it in her face, that careful interior calculation she seemed to run before committing to anything. Let me see the books, she said finally. He nodded. After breakfast. Mabel, who had been following this conversation with her cup in her lap and her eyes moving between them like she was watching a card game, said, Are we staying? Evelyn looked at Silas. Silas looked at Evelyn. For now, Evelyn said, in the tone of a woman who had learned to give her daughter truth in measured amounts. We're figuring things out. Mabel seemed to find this acceptable. She slid off the bench, picked up her suitcase, and looked at Silas. Can I come with you to see the cows? Cattle, he said automatically. Cattle, she repeated very seriously. When you're dressed, he said. And it's not for a while. Eat breakfast first. She nodded and padded back down the hallway to get dressed, still carrying the suitcase, because she was not yet at the point of leaving it anywhere. He heard the door to the spare room close. Evelyn looked at him across the table. She likes you, she said. It sounded like it surprised her. She likes the cattle, he said. She hasn't decided about me yet. A small thing happened in the corner of Evelyn's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape that comes before one, when a person has remembered that smiling is sometimes possible. She decided, Evelyn said. She just doesn't want to seem too easy. Silas drank his coffee. Outside through the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to go pale at the horizon. That cold, pale gray that comes before the first light in November, when the world looks like it is deciding whether to bother with another day. He looked at the woman across from him, the one his brother had thrown $40 at and told to go back to Pueblo, and he thought, there is something here. He didn't know what it was yet. He didn't know if it was going to be trouble or something else. He only knew that the empty, dragging quality the ranch had carried for the past several years felt, in some small way that he couldn't explain, and wasn't going to try to, slightly less empty than it had yesterday. He was not going to say that. He was not sure he had them shits for it, even if he wanted to. But he thought it, sitting in his kitchen with a woman he had known for less than 12 hours, listening to a 5-year-old wrestle with her boots in the room down the hall. Then Mabel appeared in the doorway again, fully dressed, boots on the wrong feet, suitcase in hand, ready to see the cattle. You've got those switched, Silas said. She looked down. She sat on the floor in the middle of the kitchen doorway with no self-consciousness whatsoever and switched the boots and stood back up. Ready, she said. He realized, going to have to fix the leak in the spare room roof. He fixed the roof leak on a Thursday. It was not a complicated repair, a split shingle, and a gap in the flashing where the north-facing slope met the chimney stack, but it had been waiting since September because there had always been something more urgent, and now he was up on the roof in the early morning cold with a hammer and a pocket full of nails, while Mabel stood below in the yard and watched him with the focused attention of someone studying a process she intended to understand completely. Why does the water come in? She called up. Because the shingle cracked, he said, without looking down. Why did it crack? Because it got old, a pause. Do things just get old and crack? He drove a nail. Most things. She thought about this for a moment with the seriousness she applied to most things. Does the whole roof have to get fixed, or just that part? Just that part. For now. What about later? Silas sat back on his heels and looked down at her. She was wearing the coat with the 2 short sleeves, and holding a stick she had picked up somewhere, turning it slowly in her hands. Not as a toy, but as something to do with her hands while her mind was busy. He had started to notice that about her. She was always doing something with her hands when she was thinking. Later I'll fix the rest of it, he said, one piece at a time. She seemed to accept this as a reasonable approach to most problems, because she nodded and went back to turning her stick. He finished the repair and came down the ladder and found her still in the yard, now drawing something in the dirt with the stick. He came to look. It was a rough rectangle with 4 lines coming off the corners. What's that? He said. The house, she said, and those are the fences. She added another line. And that's where the cattle go. He studied it. The proportions were wrong, the house was too small, and the pasture was enormous, but the spatial relationship between the structures was roughly accurate, which meant she had been paying attention to the layout of the ranch in a way he hadn't expected. You drew it from memory? He asked. She looked up. Is it wrong? The house is small. The field is big, she said, as if this explained the discrepancy, which, in its own logic, it did. He went in for breakfast and thought about what a strange thing it was that a 5-year-old he had known for less than a week was already beginning to map the place in her head like she was planning to stay. Evelyn found the ledger on the second morning. Silas had left it on the kitchen table the night before. Not quite casually, it was a deliberate placing, an invitation that he hadn't been able to bring himself to make directly. So he made it indirectly instead and hoped she would understand what he meant. She did. He came in from the morning cattle check to find her at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her, a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and the expression on her face of someone reading a document that is significantly worse than they expected. She did not say anything when he came in. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her and waited. "How long has it been kept like this?" she said finally. 11 years, he said, more or less. She turned a page. He watched her eyes move down the column, stopping, going back, moving forward again. She had a way of reading that was very still. The rest of her went quiet when she was processing something, like all available resources were being redirected to one task. "These entries in March," she said. "What are they?" "Feed, I think. There was a bad spring we had to buy in." "From whom?" "A supplier in Alamosa. We have an account." "How much is on it?" He didn't know. He said so. She went back to the ledger. He drank his coffee. Outside, through the window, he could hear Mabel talking to the dog. There was a ranch dog named Pepper, who had been deeply suspicious of the new arrivals for the first 2 days, and had then abruptly decided that Mabel was the most interesting development in his life in years, a conversion that Mabel had accepted as her due. "Silas," Evelyn said. "Yeah. How much does your brother think the ranch owes the Alamosa supplier?" He thought. "He said $40 last month, maybe 50 now." Evelyn turned the ledger so he could see it and set her finger on a column of figures. "It's closer to 120, she said. "Possibly more, depending on what these entries mean. And I can't tell because they're written in some kind of shorthand that I assume makes sense to whoever wrote it." He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "Brock does the accounts," he said. "I understand that," she said carefully. "I'm not trying to—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm not saying it to cause trouble. I'm saying it because you asked me to look and I looked." "I know." He rubbed the back of his jaw. "How bad is it?" She considered the question. "It's not unfixable," she said. "But it's been ignored for long enough that the fixes are going to happen soon, not eventually." She turned another page. "You've got cattle sales that weren't tracked properly, so you don't actually know what your profit margin per head is. You've got supplies going out against accounts that haven't been balanced, which means you're probably being overcharged and don't know it. And there's a note here from a bank in Pueblo that I can't fully interpret, but that looks like it might be a lien." The word lien settled in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. "A liens," he said. "I can't be certain. I'd need to see the original paperwork." "Brock has the paperwork." She said nothing to that. She closed the ledger carefully and put her hands flat on the cover, and for a moment she looked like a person deciding how much of her opinion she was allowed to have. "He's not going to like this," Silas said. "Probably not," she agreed. "If I bring this to him, he's going." He stopped. "He does not take well to being told he's wrong about something." "I know," she said quietly. "Neither do most people." She looked up at him. "But you already knew something was off. That's why you showed me the ledger." He had known. He had known for 2 years that the numbers weren't adding up and hadn't been able to prove it because he didn't have the language for it, the specific accounting language that would let him point at the exact problem instead of just gesturing vaguely at the general wrongness. Now he had someone who could provide that language, and the problem with having the language was that it made the thing undeniable. "Give me a few days," she said. "Let me go through all of it. I'll write it out clearly. Then you can decide what you want to do with it." He looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" She held his gaze without looking away. "Because you gave me and my daughter a room and a meal when your brother was ready to put us in a wagon in the dark," she said. "And because the books are a mess and I can fix them, and there is not a single reason to let something fixable stay broken." The practical efficiency of this answer was so characteristic of her that something in him almost laughed. "Almost all right," he said. "Take whatever time you need." Brock's reaction was exactly what Silas had expected and not what he was prepared for. He found his brother in the barn on the 4th day, checking on a heifer that had been off her feed, and told him simply that Evelyn had found some problems in the ledger and wanted to go over them with him. He said it as straightforwardly as he could, without softening or embellishing, because that was the only approach with Brock that ever had any effect. Brock stopped what he was doing and looked at him. "She's been in the ledger," he said. "I asked her to look," Silas said. "I told you 2 years ago that I thought something was wrong. I couldn't find it myself. She found it in 2 days. She's been here a week. I know when she got here." Brock turned back to the heifer. "She's not a bookkeeper." "She's better than whoever's been doing it," Silas said, which was not diplomatic, but he was past the point of managing Brock's feelings about this particular truth. "I've been doing it. I know, Brock. The silence in the barn was the specific silence of two brothers who have had versions of this argument before, and are both aware that it doesn't end cleanly. The heifer shifted her weight and huffed through her nose. The barn smelled like hay and animal warmth, the particular familiar smell that Silas had grown up with and that still had the power to make him feel, for a moment, like a younger version of himself, a version that still believed things would work out because they had to. She found a lien note, he said. Brock went still. From the bank in Pueblo, Evelyn thinks it's a lien. She's not certain. She says she needs to see the original paperwork. He waited. Brock, is there a lien? The pause was 3 seconds too long. In a different kind of conversation, that pause would mean nothing. In this one, it meant everything. There's a note, Brock said. It's been extended. There's no problem with it as long as we keep current. Are we current? Another pause, mostly. Silas pressed his hands flat against the top of the stall divider and looked at the wood grain. He breathed in through his nose. He was aware that what he said next was going to matter, that this was one of those moments where you could choose the thing that kept the peace and let the problem continue, or the thing that actually addressed the problem at the cost of the peace. I want her to look at all of it, he said, the note, the Alamosa account, all of it. And then I want to know where we actually stand. Not where you think we stand, where we actually stand. You don't trust I trust you fine, Silas said. I don't trust the books. There's a difference. He looked at his brother. Let her help. She's good at this. Let her help, or we're going to be in a situation in another year that we can't fix because we waited too long. Brock looked at the heifer. Brock looked at the barn door. Brock looked finally at his brother with the expression of a man who has been told something he already knew and has been spending considerable energy not knowing. Fine, he said. Tell her she can look at the papers. He said nothing else. He went back to the heifer. Silas left the barn and stood outside in the cold air and breathed for a moment before going to find Evelyn. She was in the yard teaching Mabel to identify the different tracks in the mud near the water trough, cattle prints, dog prints, boot prints, with the patient methodical approach she applied to everything educational. Mabel was crouched down, one finger tracing the outline of a large boot print, deeply concentrated. That's yours, Mabel said, looking up at Silas as he approached. Your boots are big, guilty, he said. Evelyn straightened. She read his face the way she had started reading everything quickly, without making it obvious that she was doing it. He'll show you the papers, Silas said. She nodded once. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He's not happy. He doesn't have to be happy, she said. He just has to let me look. Mabel, who was still crouched examining the mud, said, Is Brock still mad? He's not mad, Evelyn said. He's adjusting. That's what you say when someone's mad, Mabel said, with the calm authority of long observation. Neither adult responded to this, which was its own kind of answer. The papers confirmed everything. Evelyn spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table after dinner, the lamp turned up high, going through the banknote and the supply accounts and the cattle sales records in a systematic way that reminded Silas of watching a surgeon work careful, methodical, nothing wasted. She made notes in a separate notebook she had produced from her bag, writing in a small, precise hand that was very different from Brock's ledger scrawl. By the end of the 3rd evening, she had a clear picture. She laid it out for Silas and Brock, both at the kitchen table, with the notebook open between them. The lien on the property was real. It had been taken out 3 years ago against a bad cattle season, and it had been extended twice. The extension terms included an interest clause that Brock had either not read carefully or not understood, which meant the balance had grown. They owed the Pueblo Bank considerably more than Brock had believed. In addition, the Alamosa supplier account was past due, and there was a pattern in the cattle sale records of selling too low not by much, but consistently, which over 4 years added up to a significant shortfall. None of it was unfixable. That was what she said first before she said anything else. None of it is unfixable, but some of it needs to be addressed within the next 6 months, or the lien terms will trigger an assessment, and that becomes a different kind of problem. Brock sat across the table and listened without speaking. His hands were folded on the table, and his face was unreadable, which was what Brock's face looked like when he was working very hard to keep something from showing. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, How do you fix the supplier account? She told him. He listened. He asked 2 more questions, practical questions, the kind of questions that told Silas his brother had already accepted the information and moved past the anger into the problem-solving, which was the best Brock ever managed when he had been wrong about something. He wouldn't apologize, he would just start doing the next thing. After Brock went to bed, Evelyn sat at the table gathering her papers together, and Silas refilled his coffee and sat across from her. He took that better than I expected, he said. He took it like a man who's been worried about something for 3 years and is relieved that someone else can see it too, she said. She didn't say it unkindly, she said it like an observation. Silas considered this. It was probably accurate. Brock was a man who could carry a problem for years without naming it, and the unnamed weight of a thing was often heavier than the named one. "Where did you learn all of this?" he said. She stacked the papers. "My father was a merchant. Small goods, dry goods, nothing impressive. But he kept meticulous books and he taught me how, because he didn't have a son and he was practical enough not to care who learned as long as someone did." She paused. "My husband's accounts were less organized. I spent 4 years trying to make sense of them, and then he died, and it turned out there was less there than either of us thought. And Mabel and I had 6 months of savings, and not much else." She said this without drama. It was just the facts of it. "Is that why you answered the agency letter?" he said. She looked at him directly. "I answered the agency letter because I needed a stable situation for my daughter, and I was out of options I liked better." She paused. "I want to be honest with you about that. I wasn't romantic about it. I was looking for something practical." "I know," he said. I wasn't asking because I expected it to be something else." She looked at him for a moment. "What were you asking?" He thought about it. "I was asking because I think I understand it," he said. "Doing what you have to do to keep something intact, something that matters to you." Her expression shifted very slightly. Not softened exactly, she didn't soften in obvious ways, but something in it moved. "The ranch matters to you," she said. "Mabel matters to you," he said. They looked at each other across the lamplit table, and there was something in the space between them that neither of them named, partly because they were both people who were careful about naming things before they were sure of them, and partly because it was too early, and partly because it was warm in the kitchen, and the fire was good, and some moment scents don't need to be moved out of too quickly. "I should get some sleep," she said. "Yeah," he said. She went. He sat for another few minutes with his cooling coffee and listened to the wind pick up outside and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The town of Harlan was 8 miles from the ranch, and Evelyn made the trip for the first time on the 10th day, riding beside Silas in the wagon to collect supplies and meet the Alamosa supplier's local representative and begin what she had described very precisely as the process of clarifying the account. Mabel came with them. She sat between them on the wagon bench, which put her at shoulder height to neither of them, and required her to look slightly up at whichever one she was addressing, a situation she navigated with complete composure. Harlan was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery, a post office that was also occasionally a barber shop, a feed supplier, and enough other establishments to constitute a functional community without constituting anything you'd call impressive. The kind of town that had been there long enough to stop trying to look like something it wasn't. People noticed Evelyn. This was not surprising. She was a stranger in a small town, arriving with a rancher who had not previously been seen in the company of a woman or a child, but there was a quality to the noticing that she registered, and he registered, and neither of them directly acknowledged. Women at the general store who glanced up and then glanced at each other. The man at the feed supplier who asked Silas too casually whether he'd taken on help. Silas said, "She's staying at the ranch, her and her daughter," and left it there, which explained nothing and invited no further questions, and the man had the sense to let it go. Evelyn handled the supplier's representative with a directness that Silas had come to expect, but that seemed to genuinely surprise the representative himself, a man named Garvey who had been doing business with Brock Hargrove for years and operated under the assumption that ranchers dealt in approximations and handshakes and settled things when they got around to it. Evelyn did not deal in approximations. She had brought the account records, noted the discrepancies, and wanted to know the exact balance and the exact terms under which it could be settled. And she wanted this in writing, and she would wait while he produced it. Garvey looked at Silas. Silas kept his face neutral. Garvey produced the document. Evelyn read it, made 2 corrections to figures he had put down wrong, politely, precisely, with the receipts to back it up, and negotiated a settlement schedule that was realistic given the ranch's current cash flow, and that Garvey, somewhat to his own apparent bewilderment, agreed to. They were back at the wagon inside of 40 minutes. "You've done that before," Silas said. "Done what?" she said, settling Mabel on the bench. "Walked into a room where someone expected to manage you and not let them." She considered this. "My husband's business had creditors who thought a widow was easier to deal with than the man had been." She took the reins he offered. They were mistaken. He found to his own mild surprise that he was smiling. He turned his face toward the road before she could notice, which probably didn't work, but he tried. Mrs. Clara Doyle ran the dry goods section of the Harlan General Store and had strong opinions about most things, which she generally kept to herself, except when she felt the situation demanded otherwise. She had been watching Evelyn Voss move around her store for 20 minutes, and she had arrived at the conclusion that the situation demanded otherwise. "You're the woman staying at the Hargrove place," she said. Evelyn turned from the shelf she'd been examining. I am. There's talk, Mrs. Doyle said. She said it not as a warning, but as an information transfer, the way a person tells you there's a storm coming. Is what it is. You should know it exists. There's always talk, Evelyn said. In a town this size, talk has weight, Mrs. Doyle said. I'm not telling you it's right. I'm telling you it's real. She paused. You're living in that house with 2 unmarried men. I'm living in that house with one man who offered me a room when his brother tried to send me away in the dark, Evelyn said, with a pleasantness that had some steel running through the middle of it. I'm also aware that how things appear and how they are don't always match. I've been there 10 days. I'm working on the ranch accounts. Mrs. Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Mabel, who was examining a display of spools of thread with the intensity she applied to all new objects. Your daughter, she said. Yes. How old? 5. Mrs. Doyle made a sound that was not quite a verdict. She put the jar of buttons she'd been holding back on the shelf. Silas Hargrove is a decent man, she said. Not an easy one, but decent. His brother. She paused. Well, the town knows what it knows. What does it know? Evelyn said. Not defensively. She genuinely wanted the information. Mrs. Doyle seemed to appreciate the directness. Brock Hargrove has a reputation for making agreements and renegotiating them afterward when they don't suit him, she said. He's not dishonest exactly. He's just his own interests come first. I've noticed, Evelyn said. And Silas? He has the opposite problem, Mrs. Doyle said. He's too quiet to push for what he should have. She looked at Evelyn again with the particular look of a woman who has been watching people for a long time and has developed certain calibrations. You'll want to be careful. I'm always careful, Evelyn said. I don't mean careful in general, Mrs. Doyle said. I mean careful about what you let yourself want out of the situation. Some situations look like one thing and turn out to be another. Evelyn met her gaze steadily. Mrs. Doyle, she said, I've been careful about what I want for 6 years. I don't need to be told how. A pause. Then Mrs. Doyle said something that Evelyn had not expected, from a woman she had known for 20 minutes, in a dry goods store in a town she barely knew existed a month ago. I think you'll do all right, she said. Mabel discovered the horses on the 12th day. Silas had 4 working horses and a half-broke 3-year-old that was coming along slowly. He kept them in a paddock on the east side of the barn, and he had been aware that Mabel approached this paddock every morning and stood at the fence and looked at them with an expression of such thorough longing that it was almost painful to observe. He hadn't rushed it. He'd let her watch, because rushing a child towards something they wanted often soured the wanting. On the 12th day, he came around the corner of the barn to find her standing at the fence, her arms up on the top rail, talking to the oldest of the working horses, a gray named Sutter, 16 years old and patient beyond any reasonable expectation, in a low, continuous murmur. Sutter had his nose 2 inches from her face. Neither of them was moving. Silas stood still. His nose is soft, she said, without turning around. Yeah, he said, like velvet, close to. She still hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed on Sutter's eye, that large, dark, entirely calm eye, with a reverence that she usually reserved for things she was trying to memorize. Can I touch him? You already are, he said. Your breath's touching him. He'd have moved if he minded. She absorbed this. Then very slowly she raised her hand and placed her palm flat against the side of Sutter's nose. The horse exhaled once, warm and slow. Mabel's face did something that he looked away from, because it felt private, the expression of a child receiving something she had wanted very much and hadn't allowed herself to expect. He's nice, she said. He's old, Silas said. Old makes us impatient. Does old always make things patient? He thought about Brock. Not always, he said. But it helps with horses. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real laugh. Not the polite, managed kind, but the kind that catches a person by surprise, and it lasted only a second before she pulled it back in, as if she hadn't meant to let it out, as if she wasn't quite sure yet if this was a place where laughing was all right. He didn't say anything. He just leaned on the fence beside her and let her go back to Sutter. And after a while, she stopped being careful about it, and the laugh came back, smaller but real, when Sutter lipped at her sleeve looking for something edible. Evelyn found them there half an hour later. She stood at the corner of the barn and watched for a moment Mabel with both hands on the horse's nose, still talking, and Silas beside her with his arms on the fence and his hat pushed back, not talking, just being there. And then she made herself look at the account notebook in her hand and think about the numbers she'd been working on all morning, because she was a practical woman, and she had learned that the things that moved her most were precisely the things she had to be most careful about. It was the 15th day when Brock came to the kitchen table and sat down and said, without preamble, "You're good at this." Evelyn looked up from the ledger. At what? The accounts. The numbers. He was looking at the table, not at her. I've been doing them wrong. You've been doing them the way you knew how, she said. That's the same thing as wrong, when the way you knew how isn't working. She said nothing to this, because it was true and he knew it, And sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is sit with their own truth without helping them out of it. I want to learn, he said. What you're doing, the proper way to do it. He paused, and the pause had something in it that cost him. I'm asking you to teach me. She looked at him. Brock Hargrove, who had stood on the porch 12 days ago and thrown $40 in the dirt and told her to go back to Pueblo, was sitting at his kitchen table asking her to teach him something she was better at than he was. She watched him not look at her and understood what it had cost him to say it. She thought about whether to make it easier or harder for him. She decided on neither. Tomorrow morning, she said. After breakfast, we start from the beginning. He nodded. He got up. He almost left. Then he stopped in the doorway with his back to her and said very quietly, the girl. Mabel, she said. Mabel. He said the name like he was testing its weight. She's all right. She's not. He stopped. She's not what I expected. Evelyn held very still. What did you expect? A long pause. Trouble, he said. I expected trouble. He left. She sat at the table with the ledger open and listened to his boots on the floor until the sound faded. And then she sat for another minute doing nothing, which she almost never allowed herself to do. Then she picked up the pen and went back to the numbers. The cold came in hard that third week, faster than anyone had predicted, a front that rolled down from the north and dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 2 days. Silas spent those days working the fence lines, checking for weak spots before the freeze made repairs impossible, coming back to the house each evening with his hands cracked from the cold and his face scoured red from the wind. Evelyn had started cooking real dinners. He wasn't sure exactly when this had happened. It had been gradual, the meals getting more substantial as she figured out what the kitchen had and what the root cellar held and what could be done with the combination. By the third week, the table had become the kind of table that actually gathered people. Brock came to it. Mabel sat at it and talked through the whole meal, reporting on everything she had observed during the day with the comprehensive thoroughness of a 5-year-old correspondent. The dog lay under the table hoping for scraps. It was not a perfect situation. Brock was still adjusting to the presence of people in the house and sometimes went days without being anything better than civil. Evelyn and Silas were still finding the edges of what they were to each other, what they could say and what they couldn't, where the lines were that neither of them was ready to cross. Mabel's boots were still too small and needed replacing, and there hadn't been a chance to get to town. The lien was still there, waiting to be addressed in a way that was going to require money they didn't quite have yet. But the table was warm. The food was real. The lamp was lit. Silas was patching the north fence on a Thursday afternoon when he heard Mabel before he saw her, her voice carrying across the cold air, calling his name in the particular way she had developed for locating him on the property, somewhere between a question and a declaration. He turned and found her picking her way across the frozen ground toward him, wearing every layer she owned, a folded cloth in her gloved hands. She stopped in front of him and held it out. He took it. It was a piece of oilcloth cut and folded. Under it was a thick slice of bread with butter and a wedge of hard cheese. Mama said you'd forget to eat, she said. He looked at the bread. He looked at her. She was right, he said. She usually is. Mabel said it with a slight weariness that was purely her mother's, delivered in a 5-year-old's voice. She said to tell you the cold front's going to get worse tonight. I know she said you probably know, but she's telling you anyway. That sounds like her, he said. Mabel looked at the fence post he had been working on, at the wire strainer on the ground, beside it, at the whole operation with her habitual thoughtful attention. Does the fence always need fixing? Always, he said. He bit into the bread. She crouched down and picked up a small rock from the frozen ground and turned it in her gloved hands. Silas, she said. Yeah. Are we going to stay? She asked it with the careful neutrality of someone who has already asked themselves the question many times and is now trying to ask it out loud without the answer mattering too much. But it mattered. He could hear it underneath the careful neutrality, the same way he could hear a change in the wind underneath the silence. He swallowed the bread. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. I want you to, he said, both of you. She looked at the rock. She put it in her coat pocket. Okay, she said, just that. Okay. The way a person says something when they have been carrying a question for long enough that even a partial answer is enough to set the weight down. She turned and started back toward the house, small and solid in her layers, picking her careful way across the frozen ground. He watched her until she got to the porch, and then he went back to the fence. The cold front hit that night, harder than predicted. He lay in bed, listening to the wind work itself up against the walls of the house, and in the morning the world was white and brutal and real. And the work of the ranch resumed, as it always did, because on a working ranch in Colorado in November, nothing waits for the weather to cooperate. He went to check the cattle and found 3 of them had pushed through a weak section of the north fence and were standing in the neighbor's field, cold and indignant about it. He spent 2 hours bringing them back and repairing the breach while his hands went numb, and the wind drove ice crystals against every exposed patch of skin. He came back to the house at midday and found Evelyn in the kitchen with the account book open, her breath misting slightly in the air because she had let the fire go low while she was working and hadn't noticed. "Fire," he said. She looked up, looked at the stove. "Right," she said with the tone of a person recalibrating. "Sorry." "Don't be sorry," he said. He went to the stove and built it back up, hands still half numb, and she came to stand beside him while the heat grew and held her hands out toward it. And they stood there for a moment, close together in the warming kitchen, without saying anything, both looking at the fire, both aware of each other's proximity, and both choosing, by some unspoken agreement, not to move away from it. The cold outside pressed against the windows. The fire popped once and caught. "The fence held?" she said. "Mostly," he said. "I'll need to replace a section before it gets worse." She nodded. "I found a way to consolidate the Alamosa payment and push the timeline. It'll cost us one of the fall cattle sales, but it clears the account. Show me after dinner," he said. "All right." They stepped back from the stove. The kitchen was warm now. Through the window he could see the yard, white and still, and beyond the yard the bare trees along the fence line, and beyond those the faint line of the mountains holding the sky up at its edges. 3 weeks ago he had come home expecting a quiet evening. He thought about what a strange thing it was, the way a life could change direction without announcing itself, not in a moment of obvious drama, but in something as small as a child's suitcase, a refused envelope, and the fact that he had let go of his horse's reins and walked toward the porch instead of away from it. He picked up his coffee. She picked up her pen, and outside the cold front settled in over the San Luis Valley, and the work went on as work always did, around and underneath and through whatever else was happening. The section of north fence Silas had patched in November held through December, which was longer than he had expected and shorter than he had hoped. He found the breach on a Monday morning, just before the second major storm of the winter rolled in a long diagonal split where the frozen ground had heaved under one of the posts and pushed it sideways, pulling the wire with it. The cattle hadn't found it yet. He counted himself lucky for that and went back to the barn for the post driver and wire strainer, and spent the better part of the morning working in temperatures that hovered just above the point where effort stops. Feeling like effort and starts feeling like punishment. Brock was on the South Range. Silas was alone out there, which was fine. He worked alone well. Always had. What he kept noticing in the weeks since Evelyn and Mabel had been in the house was how much the quality of being alone had changed. Not the fact of it, he was still alone on the fence line, still alone in the early morning before the house woke up, but the texture of it was different. Coming back to the house at midday, and knowing there would be a fire, and something on the stove, and the sound of Mabel's voice, working through some question or observation she'd been building all morning. It had become, without him deciding to let it, the thing he oriented his day around. He was aware that this was a problem of a kind he hadn't anticipated. He drove the post and moved to the next one and kept his mind on the fence. Evelyn had been in Harlan twice more since the first trip, and by the second visit, she had developed what could only be called a reputation, though not the kind Mrs. Doyle had initially warned her about. It was the reputation of a woman who knew what she was doing and could be dealt with directly, which in a small ranching community was its own kind of currency. The Alamosa account was settled on a structured schedule she had negotiated down to terms the ranch could actually meet. She had found 2 billing errors in the feed supplier's records, the kind of errors that fell consistently in the supplier's favor, which was not quite enough to call fraud, but was certainly enough to call a pattern, and had pointed these out in writing, with documentation, and received a credit against the account and a notable change in the supplier's manner toward her. Brock watched all of this with an expression that cycled through stages. First it had been resentment, the ordinary resentment of a man who has been shown he was wrong. Then something that looked like grudging respect, which he managed with difficulty. Then, gradually, something closer to relief, the visible lightening of a man who has been carrying something heavy alone for long enough that having someone else put a hand on it registers as profound. He never thanked her directly. She didn't expect him to. She had learned Brock's register well enough by December to know that his version of gratitude was asking her opinion before making a decision, which he had begun doing quietly and without announcement, as if it had always been the arrangement. She didn't make it easy for him. She didn't make it hard either. She just answered the questions honestly and kept the books and let him adjust at whatever pace he could manage. Silas noticed all of this. He said nothing about it, which was his way, but she had started to understand that Silas's silences were not indifference, they were attention. He noticed things more carefully than most people spoke about them. The storm came in on a Tuesday. It announced itself the way bad ones did, a change in the quality of the cold, something that went beyond temperature into something atmospheric, a pressure in the air that made the cattle uneasy and made Pepper, the dog, pace the kitchen and keep looking at the door. Silas had seen enough Colorado winters to read the signs accurately. He spent Monday afternoon checking the hay stores and securing the barn and making sure the woodpile by the back door was stacked deep enough to last 3 days, because his estimate was 3 days and he had learned to plan for 4, he told Evelyn at dinner. Tomorrow's going to be bad, he said. Wind's going to come up tonight. By morning you won't want to be outside. The cattle, she said. I'll get them to the lower pasture tonight. More shelter from the bluff, I can help move them, Brock said. I'll take the dogs, Silas said. Go at first dark, before the temperature drops further. He looked at Mabel, who was listening with her fork suspended halfway between plate and mouth. You stay inside tomorrow. Both of you. Mabel put the fork down. How bad is bad? The kind of bad where you can't see your hand in front of your face, he said.
Whiteout.
She processed this with her usual careful attention. I've never seen a whiteout. You don't want to, Evelyn said. Eat your dinner. I'm just saying I haven't. Mabel. She ate her dinner. Silas and Brock moved the cattle at dusk, which meant working in the failing light and the rising wind while the temperature dropped steadily, and the first dry flakes of snow began coming in sideways off the northern range. The cattle were reluctant, the way cattle always were when they sensed a storm and didn't trust the humans proposing to move them through it. And Pepper worked the edges of the herd with the low-slung intensity that made him useful regardless of his social ambitions. By the time they had the herd settled in the lower pasture, and the gate secured, and themselves back at the barn, the snow was coming in earnest. Not yet blinding, but building toward it. Go inside, Brock said. He was heading for the house already, collar up, hat brim down. Silas stood for a moment in the barn doorway and looked at the sky, what he could see of it, which was the particular gray-white of a sky that is committed to a storm and is not interested in reconsidering. The wind was pulling at his coat, and there was a sound to it, a low, continuous frequency that he recognized. This was not going to be a 2-day storm, he went inside. By midnight, the wind was something else. Silas lay awake and listened to it. Work on the house, not the ordinary settling and creaking of a winter night, but something with intent behind it, the kind of wind that found gaps and exploited them, that pushed at windows and drove fine snow through the smallest imperfection in the weather stripping and made the lamp flames shudder behind their glass. He had built the fire up before bed and it was holding, but he could feel the cold coming through the north wall and knew the bedroom on that side, the spare room, would be losing heat. He got up. The hallway was dark. He went to the spare room door and put his knuckles against it, a quiet knock. Nothing. He knocked once more, slightly louder. The latch clicked and the door opened, and Evelyn was there in her coat over her nightgown, which meant she had been awake. Cold, he said. I know, she said. Mabel's all right. I put both blankets on her. He could see past her Mabel, a small mounded shape under the blankets, visible only as hair above the edge. Breathing steady. Move her to the kitchen tonight, he said. Warmer there. I'll make up a pallet by the stove. Evelyn didn't argue, which told him she had already been considering it. They moved Mabel together. Blankets, and all she woke up enough to mutter something that might have been a question, and then went back to sleep. As they settled her on the pallet Silas made near the stove, with folded canvas and everything soft he could find. Evelyn sat beside her for a moment with her hand on the child's back, and Silas stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the stove and thought about the cattle in the lower pasture, and whether the gate was as solid as he'd believed when he checked it 4 hours ago. It was, he told himself it was. He had checked it twice. He went back to bed. He did not sleep. The morning was white in a way that had nothing to do with light. Silas looked out the bedroom window at a world that had been erased. The yard was gone. The barn was a vague shape at the wrong distance, present only as a darker mass in the white. The wind hadn't dropped. If anything, it had organized itself overnight into something more focused and deliberate, and the snow was moving, was the fine, dry kind that went everywhere and settled nowhere, and reduced visibility to 20 feet on a good gust and considerably less on a bad one. He dressed and went to the kitchen. Evelyn was already up, the stove going properly, coffee on. Mabel was awake on her pallet, sitting up with both blankets around her shoulders, and Pepper pressed against her side, looking at the kitchen window with the expression of someone taking a storm personally. Can I go look? She said. No, said Silas and Evelyn simultaneously in the same flat tone that made Mabel blink. Not even for a second? Especially not for a second, Silas said. He poured the coffee and stood at the window. The barn was still there, which was something. He could make out the fence line closest to the house, or the post tops of it anyway, the rest buried. The lower pasture was invisible. I need to check the cattle, he said. I know, Evelyn said. She didn't say don't go, because she had been on this ranch long enough to understand that the cattle were the operation, and the operation was the thing keeping all of them here, and a man who didn't check his cattle in a blizzard was a man who might not have cattle to check afterward. She said rope. Already thought of it, he said. He tied a rope from the back porch railing to the barn door, walking it out through the first full assault of the wind, which hit him with a physical force the moment he stepped off the porch, not pushing but trying to take him apart, working into every gap in his coat and scarf, driving ice crystals against the small exposed strip of his face. He could see the rope in his hand and nothing else clearly. He got to the barn by feel as much as sight and secured the rope end and took stock. The cattle in the lower pasture were alive and grouped at the base of the bluff where the wind couldn't reach them directly. He could see the dark mass of them from the barn's south door, which he opened 2 inches and then shut again quickly. They were cold and unhappy but alive. The gate was holding. He went back to the house along the rope. He told Evelyn. She handed him dry coffee and went back to Mabel, who had, in his absence, apparently been negotiating the terms of a very limited supervised look out the door, which Evelyn had declined on the grounds that a supervised look out the door in a whiteout still ended with snow in the kitchen and a cold child. I just want to see what it looks like, Mabel said. It looks white, Evelyn said. Drink your milk. White how? White like there's nothing there, Silas said, sitting down. Like the world stopped at the porch. She thought about this with her brow furrowed. That's scary, she said. That's why you stay inside, he said. She did. For a while, the afternoon was when things went wrong. Brock had been in the barn since midday, working on a piece of equipment that had needed attention since fall, and that the forced indoor situation had given him time to address. Silas was at the kitchen table with Evelyn going over the February supply order she'd been drafting, working out what they'd need before the roads became reliably passable again. The wind had not dropped. The visibility had not improved. Pepper lifted his head from the floor. It was a particular lift, not the casual attention to sound lift that dogs do constantly, but the specific tightening of the whole body that meant something had changed in the information coming in. Silas saw it, and was already turning in his chair when Pepper got up and went to the back door, and stood there with his nose to the crack. What is it? Evelyn said. Silas was already counting. Evelyn at the table, Mabel. He looked at the pallet by the stove. The blankets were there. Pepper's spot beside them was empty because Pepper was at the door. Mabel was not on the pallet. Where is she? He said. The flatness of his voice made Evelyn turn completely. She looked at the pallet. She looked at the back door. She was on her feet before the full understanding had even finished arriving. Mabel, she went to the hallway. Mabel, she checked the spare room. The main room called again. Came back. Her face had gone a particular color. Silas was already at the back door. He opened it, and the wind came in hard, and he looked at the porch and the snow, and found what he was looking for immediately. Small boot prints, already filling in, leading off the porch in the direction of the barn. She went to the barn, he said. He said it as fact, without the terror under it, because the terror under it wasn't going to help anything right now. Oh no, Evelyn said very quietly. The barn was 120 feet from the house. He knew that distance precisely, had walked it 10,000 times, could do it in the dark. In a whiteout with no rope guide, it was a different distance entirely. A 5-year-old who had watched him go to the barn that morning and concluded she could do the same, who didn't know that the barn had only been findable because of the rope, who had probably stepped off the porch and immediately lost her bearings in the white. She's not in the barn, he said. If she was in the barn, she'd be with Brock. He was pulling on his coat as he said it. Evelyn was beside him, pulling on hers. He turned and looked at her. You stay— Don't, she said. He didn't finish the sentence. He knew what her face looked like when the answer was already settled. The rope goes to the barn, he said. You take the rope. I go wide. She grabbed the end of the barn rope from the porch railing and held it without tying it to herself, keeping it as a guide rather than an anchor, which was the right instinct. He went off the porch to the left of the rope's line, into the white, and immediately understood in his body what he had known in his head. The wind took your direction away from you. The snow took your sight. And the only thing keeping you oriented was whatever you'd memorized before the world went blank. He had memorized this yard. He knew where the water trough was, 15 feet to the left of the barn door. He knew where the wood rack stood. He knew the fence post at the yard's eastern edge had a different sound when the wind hit it. He moved through the white using these fixed points the way a man uses stepping stones in a flooded creek, going from known thing to known thing. He found her near the abandoned equipment shed at the back of the property. She was not lost in the way he had feared, not wandering, not panicked into running. She had done the right thing by instinct. When the white had closed in around her and she couldn't see the barn anymore, she had stopped moving and found the nearest solid object and put herself against it. The equipment shed's east wall. She was pressed against it with her arms around herself. Her face turned into the wall away from the wind, and her coat was already a different color from the snow working into it. He reached her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she turned and he saw her face white except for 2 high spots of red on her cheekbones, eyes tearing from the cold, and an expression of such concentrated effort not to fall apart that it hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a fist. "I just wanted to see the horses," she said. Her voice was smaller than usual but steady. The steadiness cost her. He could see what it cost her. He picked her up. She was heavier than she looked, which was always true of children denser than their size suggested, and he held her against his chest and turned back toward the house, using the same fixed points in reverse: the fence post, the water trough, the shadow of the barn, the rope Evelyn was holding like a lifeline back through the white. Evelyn was at the point where the rope met the porch. She saw them, and something in her posture released all at once like a held breath, but she didn't say anything yet. She saved it, stayed focused, held the rope taut, and guided him back in. On the porch, she took Mabel from his arms and he realized his hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs for a moment and told them to stop. Inside the stove, Brock was there, had come in from the barn through the front, which was how they'd missed him, and stood back, while Evelyn stripped Mabel's coat and checked her hands and pressed them between her own palms, checking for the white patches of frostbite, moving with the specific efficiency of a woman who had learned to manage emergencies without flinching. "Her ear," Silas said. Evelyn checked. "Cold but not white," she said. "She's all right. She's going to be all right." Mabel, who had held herself together all the way across the yard and through the door, chose this moment to cry. Not dramatically, she wasn't a dramatic child, but steadily, the kind of crying that happens when the effort of not crying has finally exceeded what a person can sustain. "I'm sorry," she said between breaths. "I'm sorry, I just—" "Stop," Evelyn said quietly, not harshly, just firm. "You're safe. Stop saying sorry." She held her daughter on the kitchen floor against the stove's warmth, and Mabel cried herself through it and out the other side, and the room was quiet except for the wind and the fire. Silas stood against the far wall. His hands had stopped shaking. He was looking at Mabel and at Evelyn, and at the way Evelyn's arms were around the child, and the way the child's hands were fisted in her mother's coat, and he was feeling something that he could not have named easily, something that went past relief and past fear and past the ordinary affection he had been aware of for weeks now, something with more weight to it, something that had changed quality in the time between seeing the empty pallet and finding her against the shed wall, had gone from one thing to something else entirely, the way water changes when the temperature crosses a certain point. He pushed off from the wall. "I'll get more wood," he said, because he needed something to do with his hands. Brock came to him in the barn an hour later. Silas was splitting wood that didn't need splitting. He had plenty stacked, but the rhythm of it was useful, the clean physical repetition, and he was still working through the hour in his head, the way you work through something that wasn't supposed to happen and did anyway. Brock didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched. "She all right?" he said finally. "She's fine," Silas said. Evelyn checked her over. "The woman knows what she's doing," Brock said. It was not quite a statement and not quite an admission. More like an observation he had finally run out of reasons not to make. "Yeah," Silas said. "The girl." He stopped Mabel. "She held herself together out there. She did." Brock shifted his weight. "I heard Evelyn say she found the shed, pressed herself against it, and stayed put." He paused. "That's what you're supposed to do. I know. Smart kid." It was the closest Brock was going to come to saying what he was actually saying, which Silas understood as, "I was wrong about her." He had been wrong about Evelyn, wrong about Mabel, wrong about all of it, and he was choosing to say so in the only way available to him, which was this, sideways, through an observation about frostbite management, in a cold barn. Silas set the axe down. "Brock, don't. I'm not going to say anything." "You were about to." He wasn't. He was just going to look at his brother for a second, with the particular look that said, "I know." "I see it. You don't have to say it." Brock looked away first. "Storm's going to break by morning," he said. "Barometric pressure's shifting." "Yeah," Silas said. They stood in the barn while the storm worked itself out against the walls, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and neither of them said anything else about any of it. By evening, Mabel was warm and dry, and had positioned herself on the kitchen bench with Pepper pressed against her and her book of horse pictures open in her lap, turning pages with the deliberate calm of someone who has had a large experience and is processing it privately. Her color was back. Her braids were unraveling in the particular way that braids did after a full day. She was herself. Silas sat across from her, ostensibly reading a feed catalog that he had already read twice this week. He was not reading it. "Silas," she said without looking up from her horses. "Yeah, were you scared?" He put the catalog down. She was still looking at her book, but she was waiting for the answer the way she waited, for all answers fully, without hedging. "Yes," he said. She turned a page. "I was scared too," she said. "But I remembered what you said about the world stopping at the porch. She traced a finger along the image of a gray horse, not unlike Sutter. So I stopped too and waited. He looked at her. He didn't have words for what he was looking at, or not words he was ready to say, so he didn't say them. He just looked at her, this small, serious, occasionally maddening, entirely herself child who had shown up on his porch 5 weeks ago holding a suitcase and trying not to cry, and who had found a shed in a whiteout and pressed herself against it and held still until he came. Good thinking, he said. She nodded seriously. I know. Evelyn came into the kitchen and stopped when she found them there, the two of them at the table in the lamplight, Mabel with her horses and Silas with his catalog, and Pepper sprawled between them, generating warmth. She had a pair of mending in her hands, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and did not say anything. He looked up and found her watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, or had seen fragments of in small moments but not all at once. Something open. Something that had for the moment stopped calculating. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and Mabel turned a page. Dinner in an hour, Evelyn said. All right, he said. She went to the stove. He went back to the catalog. Mabel got to a page with a palomino and made a small sound of approval. Outside the storm was thinning. The wind had dropped its lowest register, and through the window the dark had a different quality than it had had at noon, less absolute, more ordinary. The dark of a bad night that was becoming the dark of a night that was almost over. By morning the sky was clear. Silas went out before first light to check the cattle. They had made it through, every one of them, sheltered at the base of the bluff, exactly where he had put them. The fence gate had held. The barn was intact. The hay was sufficient for another week, even with the consumption the cold had driven up. He stood in the lower pasture in the still, crystalline air of a morning after a storm, when everything that the wind had been carrying was on the ground now, and the world had gone quiet and enormous, and the mountains to the west were so clear and close-seeming that they looked painted there, and the only sound was the cattle moving slowly, and his own breath making small white clouds in the air. He thought about the empty pallet. He thought about the boot prints filling in the snow. He thought about the weight of Mabel against his chest, and the look on Evelyn's face when she saw them coming back through the white. He understood something this morning that he had been moving toward for 5 weeks without quite arriving. It wasn't complicated, the understanding. It was actually very simple, the way the most significant things usually were, stripped down by necessity to something a person could hold in their hands. They were not guests on his land anymore. He hadn't decided this. It had become true while he was paying attention to other things, the way the important shifts often happened quietly, incrementally, and then all at once when something forced the clarity. He walked back to the house. Through the kitchen window the lamp was already lit. He could see the shape of Evelyn at the stove, moving in that particular way she had, when she was thinking about something while her hands did something else. He opened the back door and came in, and she turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "Cattle?" "All there," he said. "Coffee's on, I know." He hung his coat. He took the cup she poured and stood at the window with it and looked out at the white world, changed by the storm, and then changed again by the morning. "Mabel's still sleeping," he said. "For another hour, probably. She wore herself out being brave." He turned from the window. "She was brave," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "She was terrified," she said. "They're not mutually exclusive." "No," he said, "they're not." She turned back to the stove. He stood with his coffee. The kitchen was warm, and the morning was clear, and the ranch had come through the storm with everything still intact, which was not nothing, which was in fact a great deal, and somewhere in the house a child who had arrived 5 weeks ago with a worn suitcase and 2 uneven braids was sleeping off the previous day's terror, and would wake up in an hour ready to ask him something new. The week after the storm, Silas replaced the north fence entirely. Not just the section that had failed, not just the weak spots he had been patching since October, the whole northern run, 300 feet of it. New posts sunk 18 inches into the frozen ground, new wire strung tight. It was more work than one man could reasonably do alone in January, and Brock helped without being asked, and they worked 2 days in silence broken, only by the functional communication of men doing physical work together, and when it was done right. Evelyn noticed. She noticed the way she noticed most things on the ranch now, not as an outsider cataloging details, but as someone who understood what the details meant. The difference between a patch and a proper repair. The difference between keeping something running and actually fixing it. She didn't say anything about the fence specifically. She said, "At dinner on the second night, the north pasture should hold through March now," Silas said. "That's the idea." Brock said nothing but reached for the bread, and the way he reached for it was the way a man reaches for things when the tension in his shoulders has gone down several degrees. The 3 of them had been eating together at the kitchen table for 6 weeks. It had started as a practical matter and had become, without anyone declaring it, Something else, a shared hour at the end of the working day, where the accounts of what had happened were exchanged and the shape of the next day was roughed out, and Mabel talked continuously through most of it, and nobody told her to stop, which she had identified early on as the signal that she was welcome. That dinner, after Brock had gone to his room, Mabel had gone to sleep, and the kitchen had settled into the particular quiet of a house where everyone was accounted for and resting. Evelyn sat at the table with the account book open and said to Silas, who was still at the stove, "I want to talk to you about something." "All right," he said, and sat down. She closed the account book. This itself was significant. She almost never closed it mid-session. "The banknote," she said. "The lien. I've been looking at the payment structure, and I think there's a way to clear it in 18 months rather than 3 years. But it requires redirecting the spring cattle sale proceeds entirely. No other expenditure in May or June." He thought about this. "We'd need supplies. I've budgeted for essentials." It would be tight. She looked at him. It would be very tight. But it would clear the lien. Completely. No extension, no remaining balance. She paused. "After that, the ranch carries clean. Everything coming in is actually yours." He looked at the table for a moment. The lamp between them was burning low and needed trimming, and the shadow it threw was imprecise and warm, and he was aware of how close they were sitting, and of the fact that this was a conversation about a future that included her in it, and that they both knew that, and neither of them had said it. "It's a good plan," he said. "It's a workable plan," she said. "There's a difference, I know." He looked at her. Evelyn, she looked back. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want to say it plainly because I don't do well with the kind of talking that goes around the edges of things." She waited. She was good at waiting. "After the storm," he said, "when I found Mabel and brought her back, I stood in this kitchen and I understood something that I hadn't let myself understand before." He stopped, reorganized. "I've been telling myself this was a temporary situation, that we were figuring things out, that I hadn't decided anything yet." He put his hands flat on the table the way he did when he was making sure of his ground. "That wasn't honest. I decided the day I didn't let Brock put you in the wagon. I just hadn't admitted it to myself." The silence in the kitchen was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two careful people being careful. "What did you decide?" she said, quietly. "That I wanted you here," he said. "Both of you. Not because you had nowhere else to go. Because He stopped again. He was not a man who said these things, and the lack of practice showed, but he kept going, which mattered more than the smoothness of it. "Because I wanted you here specifically. You and Mabel. On this ranch, in this kitchen." He paused. "That's what I decided." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. He let her look, didn't fill the space. "Silas," she said. "Yeah. I came here because I was out of options I preferred," she said. "I told you that. I wasn't—" She chose her words carefully, the way she always did. "I wasn't looking for something. I was looking for something stable for Mabel. That was the whole of it." "I know," he said, "but—" She pressed her lips together, then continued. "But I've been here 7 weeks, and I know the difference between a situation that's working and a situation that's—" She stopped. "Something else," she said. "And I don't know what to do with something else. Because I have Mabel to think about. And because I got things wrong before, and the cost of getting it wrong wasn't just mine." "I know that too," he said. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "You're saying you won't do it fast," he said. "You're saying if anything happens between us, it has to be honest, and it has to be slow, and it has to be able to survive being looked at in the daylight." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what I'm saying." He nodded. "Then that's how it'll be." She looked at him and he looked at her, and it was not a romantic moment in the way stories usually staged. Those things, there was no particular electricity, no dramatic shift in the atmosphere of the room. It was more like two people who had been negotiating across a table arriving, finally, at terms they both could stand behind. Which was, he thought, a more solid foundation than most of what people called romance, and would probably last longer. "Good night, Silas," she said. "Good night," he said. February came in dry and brutally cold and stayed that way for 3 weeks. The work contracted as it always did in deep winter to the essentials: cattle, feed, fences, firewood, and the inside work that the weather forced. Brock spent hours at the kitchen table across from Evelyn, going through the accounting methodology she had been teaching him, with the focused stubbornness of a man who has decided to learn something and is not going to let his own frustration stop him. He made mistakes, he erased them. He made different ones. He did not quit, which was the thing about Brock that Silas had always respected. Even when it was directed toward the wrong things, once he decided to do something, he did it. Evelyn was a patient teacher, which surprised Silas slightly. He had not expected impatience from her, but he had not expected the quality of her patience, either the specific, unpatronizing steadiness with which she let Brock figure things out at his own pace, correcting without diminishing, explaining without condescending. She treated him the same way she treated the accounts, practically, without resentment, focused on getting the numbers right. rather than on who had gotten them wrong. One evening, Silas came in from the barn and found Brock at the kitchen table alone, the ledger open in front of him, writing. Just writing in it, columns of figures, in the careful, deliberate way of someone practicing. Evelyn was in the main room. Mabel was with her. Brock was practicing his accounting at the kitchen table by lamplight, alone, voluntarily. Silas went to the stove for coffee and said nothing. After a moment, without looking up, Brock said, I owe her an apology. Silas waited. For the porch, Brock said the first day. You should tell her that, Silas said. Not me. Brock's jaw moved slightly. I know that. He didn't say anything more about it that night, and Silas didn't push it. And 3 days later, he found them both in the kitchen mid-morning, Brock standing at the counter with his coffee and Evelyn at the table, and there was something about the air in the room that suggested a conversation had just finished. Not a loud one, not an easy one, but one that had come to some kind of completion. He looked at Evelyn. She gave him the faintest inclination of her head. He poured his coffee and went back out. The ranch's social life, such as it was, existed primarily through the town of Harlan, and in February it contracted further to the occasional supply run and whatever news those trips carried back. But in late February, Mrs. Doyle sent word through the feed supplier that there was a gathering at the Hendersons' place, the largest ranch in the area, at the end of the month. The kind of gathering that was partly social and partly practical, a way for the scattered families of the valley to check in on each other after the hardest part of winter. Silas had been to these things before and generally left early. He mentioned it at dinner and looked at Evelyn and said she didn't have to go if she'd rather not. And Evelyn said she'd like to go. And Mabel said she'd like to go too. And Brock said he'd stay with the cattle, which was the most comfortable option for everyone, including Brock. The Henderson gathering was the first time the valley community saw Evelyn and Mabel as part of the Hargrove ranch, and Silas was aware of the looking. He was not unaware, had never been unaware, that his brother had sent for a mail-order bride, and that the town knew this, and that the bride had ended up at the younger brother's side instead. He had thought about it on the drive over, the 8 miles in the wagon with Evelyn beside him and Mabel between them, wrapped in layers, asking questions about every landmark they passed. He had decided somewhere before the 2nd mile that he didn't particularly care about the looking. He cared about the people doing it. There was a difference. Evelyn walked into the Henderson house like a woman who had decided, prior to arriving, that she had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. She wore her good dress, which was dark blue and well-made, though not new, and her hair was up in a way that Silas had not seen before, and that he found himself noticing, with an awareness he kept to himself. Mabel had been given new boots. Evelyn had finally gotten to Harlan for them, and she walked in these boots with the conscious pride of someone for whom new shoes were not an ordinary occurrence. The women of the valley found Evelyn within the first 20 minutes. Mrs. Doyle was there, and a woman named Ruth Henderson, who was the host, and who had the practical, measured manners of someone who ran a large household and a cattle operation, and had long since stopped being impressed by things that weren't useful, and a younger woman named Ann Carey, whose husband ran the neighboring spread to the east, who had heard enough about Evelyn Voss's work on the Hargrove accounts through the supplier's network to approach her with something close to professional interest. Silas watched from across the room, talking cattle yield with Henderson and another rancher, and he saw the moment Evelyn became a known quantity in this community, rather than an unknown one. It was not dramatic. It was just a conversation, and then another, and then Ruth Henderson said something that made Evelyn laugh, a real laugh, not the managed kind, and after that the tension that she had been carrying in her shoulders since they walked in went down by several degrees. Mabel had found 2 other children within 4 minutes of arriving, as children do, and could be heard somewhere in the back of the house, being generally audible. On the drive home, with Mabel asleep between them and the stars very bright and very cold overhead, Evelyn said Mrs. Henderson asked if I would look at their accounts. Silas looked at her. What did you tell her? I said I'd think about it. She paused. She offered to pay. Actual payment, he considered this. That would be income, he said. That's what I thought. She looked at the road. I don't want to overstep. It's your ranch. It's not overstepping, he said. It's your skill. If you want to use it, use it. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't asking permission, she said. I was telling you because it affects my time here. I know, he said. He had gotten that wrong and he knew it. I meant it more like it's a good idea. You should. She looked at him in the dark. Yes, she said, I should. Spring came in late and cold, the way it did in the San Luis Valley, where the elevation kept winter's fingers in the soil until April and sometimes beyond. But it came. The cattle operation expanded. Silas had been planning a small expansion since fall, 12 additional head. A modest increase that the improved pasture management could support, and with the accounts in better order and Evelyn's consolidation plan in motion, the timing was right. He drove to a sale in early April and came back with 14 head instead of 12 because the price had been good and his judgment on the animals had been sound. And Evelyn looked at the 14 cattle and then at him with the expression of a woman making a note about optimism and budget adherence. 14, she said. The 2 extra were a good price, he said. I know, she said. I'll adjust the feed projections. I should have. It's done, she said. They're good animals. I can see that, she paused. Next time, tell me first. Next time I'll tell you first, he said. It was a negotiation, and they both knew it, not about the cattle, not really, but about the shape of the thing they were building, what decisions required consultation, and what decisions a person made on their own and answered for afterward. They were still finding those lines. They made mistakes on both sides of them. What they didn't do was pretend the mistakes hadn't happened, which was the thing that made the disagreements manageable rather than accumulating. Mabel turned 6 in April. Evelyn made a cake using honey instead of sugar, because sugar was still a rationed commodity, and Silas rode to town and came back with a small wrapped package that he produced at dinner and set in front of Mabel without ceremony. She looked at it. She looked at him. She unwrapped it with the controlled restraint of a child who wants to rip into something, but is making herself be careful. Inside was a book. Not a picture book, a proper chapter book, though one with illustrations. A story about a girl in the American frontier who raised and trained horses. He had asked Mrs. Doyle, who had ordered it from Denver. Mabel held it with both hands and looked at the cover for a long time without speaking, which was unusual for her. Then she said quietly, "It's about horses, I noticed," he said. She looked up at him. He had expected her to say something else. She always had something else, but she just looked at him with those serious gray eyes. And he looked back, and after a moment she got down from the bench and crossed to his side of the table and pressed herself against his arm the way she pressed against Pepper when she was cold or tired, which was the most uncalculated thing she ever did, and therefore the truest. He put his arm around her without making anything of it. She leaned against his side and held her book, and the dinner continued around them, and Evelyn watched from across the table with an expression that she kept nearly to herself, though not entirely. It was late May when Silas asked. He had been thinking about how to do it for weeks, which was longer than it needed to take, but he was not a man who moved faster than he was sure of. He had been sure for a while. The problem was that being sure of his own feeling was not the same as being sure of the ask of the right timing, the right manner, the absence of anything that could be read as pressure. He found his opportunity not in any stage moment, but in an ordinary one. An evening in the yard after dinner, the long light of late spring making everything that gold color that only happened for an hour each day. Evelyn was in the garden she had started in April, a proper kitchen garden, the kind the ranch hadn't had in years, pulling something that needed pulling. Her sleeves rolled up, practical and entirely herself. Mabel was with Sutter at the paddock fence. Brock was somewhere on the south range. Silas came out and helped with the garden without being asked, because that was how it was between them now, the helping without ceremony. They worked for a while, in the evening quiet. Then he straightened up and said, not looking at her, because sometimes it was easier, "I want to marry you." She went still. She had her hands in the dirt and she went still. Not because of the arrangement, he said. Not because of the ranch or the accounts, or because it makes sense on paper. Because I want to, he paused. And I want to be Mabel's father. Not her guardian, not the man she lives with, her father. He stopped. If she'd have me. The evening light was doing its gold thing across the garden. Somewhere at the paddock, Mabel was talking to Sutter in her murmuring way. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at her hands for a moment, then at him. She had been waiting for this question without letting herself expect it, which was the discipline of a woman who had learned that wanting something too much was its own kind of danger. "It won't be easy," she said. "It's not easy now," he said. "We're already doing it. I'm just asking if we do it on purpose." Something shifted in her face. Not tears, she was not given to tears easily, but something that was the internal equivalent. "Something moving," asked Mabel, she said. He blinked. "What?" asked Mabel, she said again. "What you said about being her father." "That's not my answer to give." She held his gaze. "Ask her first, then ask me." He looked at her for a moment, understanding what she was telling him, that Mabel's answer mattered to Evelyn as much as her own, maybe more, that the two could not be separated, and that anyone who thought otherwise had not understood what he was really asking. He had understood it. He just hadn't expected her to say it so directly. He walked to the paddock fence. Mabel was in her usual position, arms on the top rail, face level with Sutter's nose. She heard him coming and turned, and he crouched down the way he had on that first porch, 100 small disasters in a winter and a spring ago, and she looked at him with those gray eyes that had never stopped being direct. "Mabel's," he said. "Yeah. I want to marry your mama." He said it plain, the way he said everything to her. "And I want to be your father if you want me to." She looked at him. She was 6 years old, and she looked at him with 6 years' worth of accumulated assessment, and thought the thinking he had watched her do on fence posts and horse noses and ledger entries and boot prints in mud, and it was, in its way, the most serious look he had ever received. "Would I call you Papa?" she said. "If you want to," he said. "Or Silas, whatever fits." She turned back to Sutter for a moment like she needed to consult him. Sutter was no help, being a horse, and turned his head toward a noise in the barn. Then Mabel turned back. "You came and got me in the storm," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You didn't have to." She looked at him one more time with that look. "Okay," she said. "Papa." The word was so small and so complete that he stayed crouched at the paddock fence for a moment after she turned back to the horse, not trusting himself to stand up immediately, not trusting his hands or his face to behave correctly if he moved too fast. He stood. He walked back to the garden. Evelyn was standing now, watching him come. She had read his face before he got within speaking distance. "Yes," she said, before he could say anything. "I haven't asked again yet," he said. "Yes," she said again. He stopped in front of her. He was not a demonstrative man in public, and they were technically in a yard where anyone could see, and he was aware of all of this, and then he put his hands on her face and kissed her once. Careful and deliberate, which was the way he did everything. She put her hands against his chest and kissed him back, which was the way she did everything, meeting it directly, without apology. From the paddock fence, Mabel's voice, "Are you kissing?" They separated. Silas turned. Mabel was watching them over her shoulder from the fence, Sutter entirely uninterested beside her. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Okay," Mabel said, and turned back to the horse. They were married in Harlan in June, in the courthouse, with Brock as witness and Mrs. Doyle and Ruth Henderson as the other two, and Mabel in her good dress holding a small bunch of wildflowers that Silas had picked that morning from the creek bank because he had not been able to get to town for anything more organized, and she had been delighted by them anyway, which was more than organized would have gotten him. It was not a large wedding. It was not a long ceremony. The justice of the peace said the words, and Silas said his, and Evelyn said hers, and then it was done, and they went to the general store, and Mrs. Doyle produced a cake she had been making in secret for a week, and Mabel ate 2 pieces and reported this information to everyone present, as if it reflected well on her character, which Silas supposed it did. On the drive home, the same road, the same wagon, but different now, in the way that the same road is different when you know where it goes. Mabel fell asleep between them with her head on Evelyn's arm and the wildflowers still in her hand, a little wilted, and the evening came in slow and warm, and Silas drove the horses home. "Are you happy?" Evelyn said quietly, so as not to wake Mabel. He considered the question with his usual thoroughness. "Yeah," he said, "I am." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the sleeping child between them. He kept his eyes on the road and felt the weight of her there, and thought about the ranch ahead of them, the new fence, the 14 cattle, the garden, the accounts that finally made sense, the book about frontier horses sitting on a shelf in the spare room that was Mabel's room now, not the spare room. "The lien payment comes out of the June revenue," she said. "I know," he said. "We'll be tight through August." "We'll manage," he said. "Yes," she said, "we will." The horses knew the way home. They always did in the end. Silas let them set the pace and listened to the evening sounds, and felt the solid warmth of his wife against his shoulder and the weight of the sleeping child between them, and thought about nothing in particular, except that some decisions look small when you make them, and only show their true size later. Letting go of a horse's reins, walking toward a porch instead of away from it, crouching down to eye level with a 5-year-old who was trying not to cry. The small decisions were the ones that built everything. He had learned that this year in ways he hadn't expected to learn anything. At 43, on a ranch he'd thought he understood completely. The ranch was different now. He was different now. The difference had arrived in a wagon from Pueblo in November, holding a worn suitcase and a child who kept a single sock in memory of Cincinnati, and it had stayed. He was glad it had stayed. The road home ran straight through the evening toward the mountains, and the horses pulled steady, and the world went gold, and then slowly dark, and the ranch waited for them at the end of it, lamp unlit but familiar, the fence posts standing straight along the north line where they had put them in. In January, the garden Evelyn had planted now green and starting to reach, and somewhere in the barn old Sutter standing patient in his stall, waiting for morning, and the small hands that would come find him there. The lien cleared in August. Evelyn set the bank's confirmation letter on the kitchen table at breakfast without saying anything about it, just placed it there beside Silas's coffee cup and went back to the stove. He picked it up. He read it twice. He set it down and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the north fence line, straight and solid in the morning light, and didn't say anything either. Brock came in from the barn, poured himself coffee, saw the letter. He read it standing up. He put it back on the table. He said, which was Brock's version of a considerable statement. Mabel came in last, still pulling her braid into order, and looked at the three adults standing in the kitchen with the particular alertness of a child who has learned to read rooms. She looked at the letter. She looked at Silas. "Is that good news?" "Yes," he said. "How good?" "The best kind," Evelyn said from the stove. "The kind that's been a long time coming." Mabel nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, sat down and asked for eggs. The letter went into the ranch's document box, the same battered tin box where Silas had always kept the deed and the certificates and the notes of agreement that constituted the legal skeleton of the operation. He put it in there that evening, after dinner, and closed the lid, and felt the particular quiet that comes not from happiness exactly, but from the lifting of a weight that has been present so long you stopped being aware of carrying it. The ranch was clean. Everything coming in was actually theirs. The 3 years after the wedding were not easy years. They were not supposed to be. A working cattle ranch in the San Luis Valley in the 1880s was not a setting that rewarded the expectation of ease, and neither Silas nor Evelyn had ever been people who expected it. What they had instead was the particular kind of life that is built from consistent effort in the same direction, not dramatic, not cinematic, but accumulating, the way a fence gets built, one post at a time. The cattle operation grew. Slowly, deliberately, the way Silas did everything. 14 additional head became 20, became 30 as the pasture management improved, and the financial discipline Evelyn maintained allowed for reinvestment instead of just survival. He added a second water trough in the lower pasture and rebuilt the barn's south wall, which had been listing since the year before he arrived, and hired a man named Calhoun 2 days a week during calving season, because he and Brock could not manage the numbers alone any longer. Calhoun was a quiet man in his 60s who had been ranching since before Silas was born, and who accepted Evelyn's role on the operation without comment, which Silas appreciated. The Valley's community had largely arrived at the same accommodation. There had been talk once in the way Mrs. Doyle had worn the expected talk of a small place working through an unexpected arrangement, and then the talk had faded, as talk does when the thing it's discussing turns out to be less interesting than whatever comes next. What replaced it was something more practical. Evelyn had built a modest bookkeeping practice serving 3 ranches and the Harlan feed supplier, working out of the kitchen on mornings when Mabel was at the schoolhouse that the Valley families maintained jointly 8 miles toward town. She was good at it and she charged fairly, and she did not socialize the work unnecessarily, which suited her clients, most of whom were men who had spent their lives in communities where a woman's competence was treated as an anomaly requiring explanation. She did not explain it. She did the work and presented the figures, and let accuracy make its own argument. Mabel, meanwhile, was growing into someone specific. This was the thing about children that Silas had not known before, and now knew completely. They arrived as potential and became incrementally actual people, with actual preferences and actual stubborn corners and actual gifts, and watching it happen was one of the stranger and more engrossing experiences available to a human being. He had not expected to find it engrossing. He found it engrossing. She was 7, 8, 9, each year a different version of herself, each version more defined. She had her mother's precision and her own wildness, which was a combination that produced a child who could calculate the feed conversion ratio on the cattle operation, and also fell out of the apple tree twice in the same month, attempting to reach a bird's nest. She was not graceful. She was not easily intimidated. She had decided at some point in her 7th year that the horses were her primary domain, and she prosecuted this claim with a thoroughness that eventually resulted in Silas teaching her to ride properly, which took 3 months and considerable mutual stubbornness, and at the end of which she rode better than most adults he knew. She called him Papa without self-consciousness. She had from the first day, and the word had never accumulated awkwardness, which was the thing he had feared, without letting himself examine the fear. It fit the way things fit when they're right, not perfectly, not without adjustment, but solidly. The way a good post fits in the right hole. You know it when you feel it. He was not a perfect father. This was important to be honest about. He was too quiet sometimes when she needed talking. He misjudged the line between teaching her to manage difficulty and leaving her in difficulty longer than was useful. There was a period when she was 8 when she was being treated poorly by 2 of the children at the schoolhouse, the ordinary cruelty of children, targeted at the girl whose family situation didn't match the standard pattern, and he found out about it 2 months later than he should have because he had not been paying the right kind of attention, and by then Evelyn had already addressed it in the way that Evelyn addressed things, directly and without drama, and the problem had resolved. He felt the failure of the missed 2 months. He carried it. "You can't see everything," Evelyn told him when he said as much. "I should have seen that. You see a lot," she said. "You can't see all of it." She looked at him with the steady look she had, That was not comfort. Exactly, she was not a woman who offered comfort as a substitute for truth but was something adjacent. She knows you're there. That's the part that matters. He thought about that for a long time after. Brock's change was the slowest and in some ways the most complete. It happened the way erosion happens imperceptibly, and then suddenly you look and the landscape is different. The man who had stood on the porch 3 years ago and thrown $40 in the dirt was still recognizable in Brock Hargrove, but the edges of him had changed. The stubbornness was still there that would never entirely leave. It was too structural, but the direction it pointed had shifted. He was stubborn now in defense of the operation, of the family, where before he had been stubborn primarily in defense of his own position within it. Evelyn had done this, though neither of them would have described it that way. What she actually done was simply treat him with consistent, unsentimentalized respect, not deference, not flattery, but the specific respect of taking a person's capacity seriously. She expected him to learn the accounts, and he learned them. She expected him to make decisions that were informed by the numbers, and eventually he did. She never made him feel that the initial failure was his identity, which was the thing that allowed him to move past it. By the 3rd year, Brock ran the cattle operation's day-to-day decisions with a competence that Silas acknowledged freely and without complexity. It was Brock's natural domain, the animals, the pasture, the physical management of the land. Silas was better with the structural work, the infrastructure, the long planning. Evelyn ran the money and the books and, increasingly, provided the external perspective that neither brother could give himself because they were too close to the thing. It worked because they let it work. This sounds simple and is not. Letting something work requires a daily choice, often made when you are tired, and the easier option is to be irritable or territorial, or to reopen questions that have already been settled. They made that choice imperfectly and repeatedly, and the ranch absorbed the imperfections the way working land absorbs weather. It shows the marks, but it holds. Brock met a woman named Helen Marsh in the spring of the 3rd year. She was a widow from the eastern part of the county, practical and weathered and plain-spoken, who came into Harlan to sell preserves at the general store, and whom Brock encountered on 2 consecutive Saturdays before summoning what passed for social initiative in his character and introducing himself. Silas found out about this not from Brock directly but from Mabel, who had been at the store with Evelyn and observed the interaction with the comprehensive attention she applied to all human behavior. He was different, she told Silas, at the paddock fence where important reports were frequently delivered. Like he was being careful. Careful how, Silas said. She thought about it. Like how I was careful with Sutter the first time, she said, when I didn't know if he'd let me. Silas looked at his horse, who was indifferent to the conversation, and more interested in the patch of dried grass at the fence base. He thought about Brock, who had not been careful with Evelyn, had not tried to be, and what it had cost and what had been slowly rebuilt. He thought about people and their capacity for revision, which was something he had not thought much about before this years, and now thought about often. Did Sutter let you? Mabel said. I'm talking about Brock, he said. I know, she said, but did he? He let you, Silas said. You were the one he was waiting for. She smiled at that, not the managed smile, the real one, quick and bright, that she still occasionally surprised herself with. Then she went to find the horse. Helen Marsh came to dinner at the ranch in early summer, and it was a dinner that had been prepared with the specific tension of a family, trying not to appear as though they had been preparing for it. Evelyn had made a proper meal, not elaborate but correct, and Mabel had been given a lengthy and somewhat unnecessary briefing on table manners, which she received with the tolerance of someone who knows they're not the problem, but is choosing not to say so. Helen was direct and comfortable in her own skin in the way of people who have been through enough that performance no longer seems worth the effort. She and Evelyn found each other within the first 10 minutes of the meal, and talked with the ease of 2 women who had both been managing difficult situations alone, and had not had many people to talk to about it. Brock watched this with an expression that Silas had never seen on his brother's face before, something exposed, almost boyish. The expression of someone who wants very much for 2 people to like each other and is trying not to show how much he wants it. They liked each other. The dinner went long. Mabel, given the extended adult company, held herself together for an impressive period before the long day caught up with her, and she fell asleep at the table with her chin in her hand, which Helen Marsh observed with a softness in her face that told Silas everything he needed to know about whether she was right for his brother. Brock carried Mabel to her room. He came back to the kitchen doorway and stopped there, looking at the 3 adults at the table, Silas and Evelyn and Helen, the lamp between them, the dishes not yet cleared, the conversation in that easy register of people who have found their rhythm, and his face had something in it that was hard to name. Something that looked, from the outside, like the specific recognition that comes when a person sees what they almost refused and understands. Finally, the full weight of what that refusal would have cost. He sat back down. He poured more coffee. He did not say anything about it, because he was Brock, but it was there in the room with all of them, understood by everyone who needed to understand it. The year Mabel turned 10, she asked Silas to teach her to read the fence lines. Not just ride them, she had been doing that for 2 years, accompanying him on the weekly checks with the authority of someone who had earned the seat. She wanted to learn to assess them, to know what he was looking for, to understand the difference between a post that was solid and one that looked solid, but had begun to fail beneath the surface. She wanted to know what he knew. He taught her over the course of that spring and summer. It took longer than he expected because she asked questions about everything, not the disruptive questions of a child looking for attention, but the drilling, sequential questions of a person who is constructing a complete understanding and won't be satisfied with partial answers. Why does the freeze heave the post this way and not that way? What tells you the wire's tension is wrong before it actually fails? How do you know when a repair will hold and when you're only delaying the problem? He answered every question. Sometimes he had to think before answering, which she accepted without impatience. Sometimes he got to the end of an answer and realized she had identified something he did by instinct, without having fully articulated the principle beneath it, and the articulation changed the way he understood his own knowledge. "You're a good teacher," she told him one afternoon. In the straightforward way she said most things. "You're a good student," he said. She considered this. "Mama says those are different things. That a good student can make a bad teacher look good, and a good teacher can make a bad student better. But that the best thing is when they match." "Your mama's right," he said. "She usually is," Mabel said. "It's pretty annoying." He laughed. He laughed more than he used to. This was something Evelyn had once observed, quietly, as a statement of fact rather than a compliment, that he had learned to laugh more easily, and he had thought about it afterward and decided it was probably true, and that the reason was probably standing 10 feet away, examining a fence post, with his hat on her head, because she had borrowed it against the afternoon sun and not given it back. The thing about a family built by choice rather than by circumstance is that it requires a different kind of maintenance than the other kind. Blood families operate on a set of assumed obligations. You show up because you're supposed to. You tolerate because you have to. You love sometimes despite everything and sometimes because of it, and the structure holds because it doesn't depend on anyone wanting to hold it. Chosen family has no such skeleton. The structure is the choosing, renewed daily. And when someone stops choosing, the structure goes with them. Silas understood this in a way he couldn't have articulated as a principle, but lived as a practice. He chose Evelyn every day, not in any dramatic declaration, but in the 10,000 ordinary ways that constitute a life shared, asking her opinion before making decisions that affected them both, and meaning the asking. Telling her when he was wrong, which was more often than he liked, but less than it used to be. Watching her in the kitchen in the early morning when she didn't know he was watching, not with the romantic attention of courtship, but with the deeper attention of someone who is still interested, still genuinely curious about the person across from them, still discovering things, still finding the ordinary presence of that person something other than ordinary. He chose Mabel every day too in a different way. In the way he arranged his work around her, not sacrificing it, not making her the center of everything in the suffocating way that would have embarrassed her, but holding her in the architecture of his days. The fence line rides, the horse lessons. The book he brought back from a cattle sale in a town 40 miles away because a man at the sale had mentioned it was good and it was about horses, and he thought of her immediately and spent 70 cents on it without deliberating. She was 10. She would be 11. She would be 15 and 20 and 30. And she would leave, the way children do the way they should, and build her own life in her own direction. And some of what she built it on would be this ranch and this man and this particular set of years, whether she named it or not. He knew this. It did not make the 10 years less. It made them more. The winter Mabel turned 11. Brock married Helen Marsh in a ceremony slightly larger than Silas and Evelyn's had been, which was not saying much but was something. Helen moved into the ranch. There was room. There had always been room in the practical sense, and the human sense had been cleared through a long autumn of negotiation that nobody called negotiation, but everyone understood that's what it was. The house changed. It was a fuller house now. More voices, more opinion. More of the particular productive friction of people who care about each other but are also 4 distinct individuals, with 4 distinct ways of being right. Evelyn and Helen became allies with the natural ease of 2 competent women who have both spent time being underestimated and have developed similar defenses against it. Brock was better with Helen, they're less defended, more willing to be seen in the ordinary way that people need to be seen to stay connected to themselves. Mabel observed all of this, with the comprehensive attention she had always given to everything, and occasionally reported her observations to Silas at the paddock fence, or on the fence line rides, and her observations were generally accurate and occasionally uncomfortably so. Brock smiles more, she said one morning. Early spring, both of them watching the cattle in the lower pasture, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. He does, Silas said. Do you think he was lonely before? He thought about it honestly, the way she expected him to. Probably, he said. He didn't know it, but probably. She turned this over. How do you not know you're lonely? You stay busy, he said. You tell yourself the work is enough. Is it ever enough? He looked at the cattle, at the fence, at the mountains, beyond the whole visible inventory of what 11 years on this land had accumulated. For a while, he said, and then you get lucky, and something arrives that shows you what enough actually looks like. And it's bigger than you thought. She was quiet for a moment. Then, is that what happened to you? Yeah, he said. That's what happened to me. She nodded slowly, processing this the way she processed everything thoroughly, filing it somewhere it would be available later. Then she clicked her tongue at the cattle because 2 of them had drifted toward the fence, and she had decided, at 11, that drift was her responsibility to correct. He watched her move her horse toward the strays with the calm, practiced authority of someone who knows exactly what she's doing, and thought about the word lucky. He had used it because it was accurate, there was luck in it. Real luck, the arbitrary luck of timing and proximity, and the particular angle at which a man walks home from 3 days on the trail and finds a situation unfolding on his porch that he could, by any reasonable calculation, have walked away from. But luck was only the beginning of it. Luck dropped the thing in your path. What you did with it after that was entirely your own work. He had not been a man who knew how to want things for a long time before they arrived. He had managed the ranch, and managed his solitude, and told himself, in the way Brock had told himself about loneliness, that management was the same as living. It was not the same. He knew that now, with the complete knowledge of someone who has lived both versions and can feel the difference in his body in the weight of a morning when there's someone already up when you get to the kitchen, in the specific sound of a child's voice calling your name from somewhere on the property, in the feeling of coming home and meaning it. One evening in early winter, 3 years after the wedding, Silas came back from checking the south pasture fence in the failing light, a repair he'd done alone, because Brock was helping Helen with something, and Mabel had school in the morning, and he'd wanted the solitude, the particular productive solitude of a man doing familiar work in familiar landscape, and he rode up to the house in the last of the daylight and saw the kitchen window lit. Just that, the kitchen window warm against the dark. He sat on his horse for a moment in the yard and looked at it. Inside, he knew, Evelyn was doing something at the table accounts probably, or the Henderson books she'd taken on again for the winter season. The stove would be going. There would be something on it because she planned meals the way she planned everything, with the quiet efficiency of a woman for whom feeding people was not a performance but a practice. Somewhere in the house, Mabel would be reading. The horse book was long since finished, replaced by other books, a whole row of them now on the shelf in her room or asleep already, which was possible given the hour. Brock and Helen in their side of the house, the sounds of them making the house sound different than it ever had in the 11 years before. He looked at the window a moment longer. He thought about the porch 3 years ago, the envelope in the dirt, Mabel's hands white on the suitcase handle, the particular stillness of a child, trying not to understand what the adults around her were doing. He thought about the way Evelyn had looked at him that first moment, not gratefully, not with calculation, but with that careful, measuring look of a person deciding whether a situation was safe. He thought about the kitchen at 4 a.m. and the warm milk and the girl asking if they were going to leave, and his answer, which had been the truth, even when he hadn't known yet that it was the whole truth. He got off his horse. He put the horse up in the barn, took his time about it, because the horse had worked and deserved the proper attention. He carried his tack inside and hung it. He stood in the barn for a moment, in the warmth and the smell of horses and hay, and he thought about what his brother had refused, and what that refusal had made possible, and about the way the worst thing that had happened to Evelyn Voss being rejected on a porch in November, thrown an envelope and told to go back where she came from, had been the hinge on which everything else turned. He did not think this made the cruelty acceptable. The cruelty had been real, and it had cost Evelyn something real, the specific, grinding humiliation of being assessed and found insufficient, of having her daughter looked at and found inconvenient. That did not disappear because of what followed. Evelyn had said so herself, once, in a conversation about it that they had finally had in the 2nd year of their marriage, late at night when Mabel was asleep, and they had reached the kind of honesty that only comes after enough time and enough trust. She had said, "I don't think it happened for a reason. I think it happened, and then I survived it, and then I built something from the ground I landed on. There's a difference." He had thought about that distinction for a long time. He thought about it again in the barn, and then he walked to the house. He came through the back door, and the kitchen hit him with its warmth and its specific smell. Whatever was on the stove, wood smoke, coffee that had been kept too long, the particular lived-in smell of a house that was actually inhabited. Evelyn looked up from the table. She had her reading glasses on, which she had acquired in the second year after resisting them for 6 months on no particular principle, and she had a pen in her hand and a look on her face that said she was in the middle of something. Fence, she said. Good, he said. The post I reset in October held. She made a note of this or something else and looked back at her papers. He took off his coat. He poured the coffee that was too old and drank it anyway and stood at the stove. Then, from down the hall, the sound of a door and feet, and Mabel appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, with her hair loose and her book in her hand, and the expression of someone who has been asleep and woken up for reasons she hasn't fully identified yet. She saw him. Her face did the thing it did not, the managed expression. Not the careful one, just the plain, uncalculated recognition of someone who is glad to see you. You're back, she said. I'm back, he said. She came into the kitchen and leaned against his arm the way she had since she was 6. Smaller now relative to him than she used to be, but not small. She had grown considerably in the past year and would keep growing, and he put his arm around her, and she stood there for a moment in the kitchen warmth. I was reading, she said. The one about the girl who trains the Mustang. Is it good? It's very good, she said. She makes a lot of mistakes. The best ones do, he said. Evelyn looked at them over her reading glasses without saying anything. Her expression was one he had learned to read completely, the expression of a woman who is looking at something she loves and is allowing herself to know it. Mabel yawned and pushed off from his arm. I'm going back to sleep, she said. The horses need checking in the morning. I want to go early. I'll wake you, he said. She padded back down the hall. The door clicked. The house settled back into its evening quiet, which was not empty quiet, but occupied quiet. The quiet of a full house at rest. Silas sat down across from Evelyn. She put her pen down and took her reading glasses off and looked at him. Good day, she said. He thought about the fence post that it held. The south pasture and the last light. The barn and the horse properly stabled. The kitchen window seen from the yard. Good day, he said. She nodded. She put the reading glasses back on and picked up her pen. He drank the bad coffee and said nothing more, and the lamp between them burned steady, and outside the winter was doing what winter did, and inside they were warm. This was not the life he had imagined at 43, riding back from 3 days on the trail, with nothing but a quiet house waiting for him. It was not the life he had planned or angled toward, or understood himself to want. It was the life that had arrived when he made one small decision on a porch in November, the decision to walk toward rather than away, to stay rather than leave the situation to his brother, to crouch down to eye level with a frightened child and tell her the truth. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the large, obvious moment that will change everything. The burning building, the inheritance, the dramatic reversal of fortune that arrives, announced and unmistakable. And sometimes those moments come. But more often the hinge is something smaller. A porch, an envelope in the dirt, a 5-year-old's white knuckles on a suitcase handle. The hinge is rarely where you expect it. What Silas Hargrove had learned over 3 years of a life he hadn't known he was building was that the quality of a person was not visible in how they handled the large, obvious moments, but in what they did with the small ones, the moments when walking away was easy and no one would have blamed you, and the reasonable thing and the right thing were pointed in different directions. The moment on the porch had cost him nothing except a decision. And the decision had given him everything that was currently in this kitchen, and down that hall, and in the barn, and in the accounts, and along the fence lines, and in the garden, and in the row of books on a shelf, in a room that used to be a spare room and was now a room that belonged to someone. Evelyn turned a page, the stove settled. The lamp burned. He thought about Mabel asleep now, probably. Her book on the nightstand, the Mustang and the girl who made mistakes waiting for morning. He thought about the worn suitcase, which was in the back of the closet now. Too small for anything but kept because she kept it, and the blue button and the picture of her father, and the single sock in memory of Cincinnati. He thought about the first morning, 4 a.m. in this kitchen, warm milk in a small cup, a child asking, "Are you going to make us leave?" "No," he had said. "I'm not." He hadn't known then that the answer would hold for years. He hadn't known it would hold at all. Really, he had been operating on instinct and a preliminary decision, and the particular stubbornness of a man who finds it difficult to walk away from something he has looked at directly. But it had held. It had held through a winter, and a blizzard, and a lean, and 400 head of cattle, and the slow renegotiation of 2 brothers, and the gradual construction of a life that none of the people in it had planned. It had held because they had all kept choosing it, not perfectly, not without the days when the tiredness made everyone shorter than they meant to be, when the accounts didn't balance and the weather didn't cooperate, and Brock was difficult and Mabel was a child with a child's irrational intensities, and Evelyn was careful in ways that sometimes felt like distance, and Silas was quiet in ways that sometimes felt like absence. Not without all of that, but through it, the lamp needed trimming. He would do it in a minute. He sat with his bad coffee and watched his wife work, and listened to the house breathe around him and felt, in the uncomplicated way of a man who has stopped arguing with his own life, that this was where he was supposed to be. Not because it was fated, not because some larger force had arranged it, because he had walked toward a porch instead of away from it, and then every day for 3 years he had kept walking in the same direction. That was all it had been. That was all it ever needed to be. He got up and trimmed the lamp and sat back down, and the light steadied, and Evelyn looked up briefly and then back at her work, and the winter moved around the walls of the house, and the ranch held against it, and somewhere down the hall a girl who had arrived as a stranger slept in her room among her books and waited for morning and the horses. Hargrove cattle, all of them now, everyone,